Tonight, we're going somewhere cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a second blanket. The kind that freezes your eyelashes mid-blink. The kind that turns the sea around you dark as spilled ink and makes the air taste like old coins. You're standing on the deck of a medieval pirate ship. The boards beneath your boots are glazed with frost, slick enough that every step requires a small, private negotiation with gravity. The sails above hang like enormous frozen sheets, stiff and pale, creaking when the ship shifts beneath you. A lantern swings near the mast, its light warped by the cold fog curling up from the water. It doesn't so much illuminate the deck as remind you that darkness is the default setting out here. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm guessing it's late. I'm guessing you're already horizontal. Good. Stay there. Now dim the lights and let's step into the story. It's long past midnight and the sea has gone strangely still. The kind of stillness that only arrives when even the wind has decided it's done for the night. Your fingers are numb before you've taken 3 steps. Your breath puffs white against the black sky, small clouds appearing and dissolving, like the world's least impressive magic trick. Somewhere below deck, a man coughs, wet and deep, the sound of someone losing an argument with the weather. Another mutters a prayer to Saint Elmo, patron saint of sailors and lightning, his voice too low to tell whether it's gratitude or a last-ditch negotiation. The smell hits you before anything else does. Salt and tar, yes, but beneath that, something sour. Unwashed wool, maybe. Or the last of a barrel gone quietly, comprehensively bad. You look up at the rigging and try to imagine men climbing it in weather like this. Bare hands. Slick boots. Just to adjust a frozen line. The kind of task that, in the modern world, would require a strongly worded email to HR before anyone even considered it. They slept where they could, these pirates. Between barrels. On coils of rope. In whatever corner of the ship wasn't already occupied by someone larger and angrier. When the cold came, when the winter seas turned savage, survival stopped being a background concern and became the only item on the agenda. You rub your hands together, trying to remember what your fingertips feel like. The ship groans beneath you, low and slow, like a very large animal that hasn't slept properly in weeks. You understand the feeling. The ship groans again beneath your feet, and you find yourself wondering, not about treasure, not about the next raid, but about something far more basic. How does anyone survive a night like this out here? The answer, it turns out, has nothing to do with toughness or seamanship or any of the qualities that make it into the stories. It has to do with the ships themselves. And the ships were not helping. Here is what nobody tells you about medieval ships. They were not insulated, not even slightly. The planks were sealed with pitch and tar, a solution that worked reasonably well in temperate weather and cracked open like old paint the moment the temperature dropped seriously. The decks leaked. The hulls groaned. The wind didn't knock politely before entering. It simply came through whichever gap it preferred, which was all of them. The only thing standing between a pirate and hypothermia on a night like this was a threadbare blanket and the collective body heat of however many men were packed into the space below. Which sounds almost cozy until you factor in the smell. You pause near the bow, leaning over the rail. The sea below has taken on the texture of something solid. A slow, rolling plain of gray-blue ice shards drifting past in silence. Somewhere beyond the horizon are ports frozen shut, fishermen stranded ashore, and the distant theoretical concept of warmth. The pirates aboard this ship don't have access to any of that. Out here, the cold isn't a visitor that overstays its welcome. It's a permanent crew member who never pays its share and never takes a watch. Historians still debate whether pirates deliberately avoided the far north, or whether the cold simply caught them mid-route, chasing a trade ship down a channel that winter had quietly claimed while no one was looking. What's certain is that winter on a ship was merciless in ways that had nothing to do with storms or battles. The North Sea could turn to slush. The Baltic could go flat and glassy as a mirror. Ice formed on the rigging overnight until the sheer weight of it threatened to bring the masts down, which meant men had to go up there in the dark with knives and chip it free, hand over freezing hand, while the ship rolled beneath them. Nobody has invented a more miserable job in the 1,000 years since. Though several modern offices have come close, you can feel it now. The particular quality of cold that doesn't just sit on the surface of the skin, but works its way inward, methodically, like it has a checklist. First the fingers, then the toes. Then the face stops registering temperature as a sensation and starts registering it as a fact. Metal buckles stuck to skin on the worst nights. That's not dramatic license. That's a recorded historical reality. A pirate reaching for his belt in the dark might find it had made other plans. The ship shifts slightly beneath your feet, and somewhere deep in the hold, barrels roll and chains rattle. The lantern near the mast swings in a slow arc, throwing light across the frost-glazed deck in a rhythm that is almost hypnotic. You pull your coat tighter. It does very little. But you do it anyway, because that is what humans do. Make small, largely symbolic gestures against vast, indifferent forces, and find them oddly comforting. The ship groans again. The sea breathes slowly around it. You are nowhere near warm, but you are, for now, still here. You pull back from the railing and look around at the deck, at the frost-glazed boards, at the frozen ropes, at the faint swinging light of the lantern doing its unconvincing best against the dark. And you think, where exactly did these men come from? What kind of person ends up on a ship like this, in water like this, in cold like this? Not the kind the stories usually describe. There is a version of piracy that lives in the popular imagination. Sun-bleached, rum-soaked, operating somewhere between a Caribbean beach and a film set. Colorful flags, warm nights. The pleasant kind of danger. That version is not where you are right now. The romantic image of the tropical pirate came later, long after the era we're standing in. Because in medieval Europe, roughly the 13th through the 16th centuries, piracy was a northern business. A cold, gray, salt-encrusted business conducted along the North Atlantic, the English Channel, and the jagged coastlines of Scandinavia. These men didn't hunt treasure galleons in turquoise water. They raided merchant ships out of Hanseatic ports, chased cargo along icy whaling routes, and treated the North Sea less as a backdrop and more as a working environment with extremely poor conditions and no sick leave. Not the mournful, half-conscious humming of exhaustion, but something with a shape to it. A phrase that repeats, low and steady, its rhythm matching the slow rock of the ship. Another joins in. Then the third, off-key and unconcerned about it. The sound travels across the deck. Heads lift. The melody is nothing remarkable, the kind of tune that exists in the space between all songs rather than being any particular one. But it fills the cold air with something that hasn't been present since before the night's tensions made the air too tight to hold it. The captain appears at his cabin door. He stands there for a moment, coat heavy with frost, watching his crew. His expression does not change. But he watches for longer than a man checking on the ship's condition would need to watch. The word Viking had faded from common use by then. He is looking at something specific. The pairs working together, the hands held over the ember box, the humming that has spread now to a fourth voice and a fifth. And whatever he sees in it, he says nothing. He goes back inside. Some historians argue that the most effective captains in the age of sail were the ones who understood when not to speak. When the crew was doing, without being told, the thing that needed doing, when the ship was maintaining itself through some collective instinct that authority would only interrupt, the wisest response was to observe and withdraw, to let the rhythm continue. The rhythm continues. A curious detail from a 16th century chronicler describes how crews that survived the worst winters moved differently afterward. In unison, with a coordination that hadn't been trained into them but had been pressed into them by cold and necessity, the way metal takes the shape of whatever mold it's poured into. They had become, without meaning to, a single thing, not because they liked each other, not because the night's grievances had been resolved, but because the alternative to being a single thing was being several separate things, each one alone. And alone on a ship in winter was a condition that the body understood, at a level below thought, as fatal. The ember box passes from hand to hand as the morning wears on. But its spirit hadn't gone far. Each man holds it briefly, long enough to feel something, not long enough to be greedy about it, then passes it on. The ritual of it matters as much as the warmth. The acknowledgement, wordless and repeated, that what little heat exists on this ship belongs to everyone on it. You stand at the edge of the deck and breathe the cold air in, feeling it sharp and clean in your lungs. Around you, the ship moves through a sea that has loosened slightly overnight, the ice sheets drifting apart in the faint current, the hull finding water where yesterday there was only resistance. The humming has become something almost like a song. The men work in their pairs, their shoulders touching, their breath rising in small clouds that merge briefly before the wind takes them. The ember passes on. And the cold, which has been winning steadily for days, finds that it is winning slightly less this morning than it was last night, which is not victory. The echo of it lived on in men who still earned their living by sail and by plunder, who still understood that the sea was not something you conquered. It was something you negotiated with, poorly, on its terms, in weather it chose. But on a ship like this, in water like this, in weather like this, it is enough. The day fades without ceremony. One moment the light is thin and pale and present, and then it is less present, and then the distinction between sky and sea becomes theoretical rather than observable, and then it is simply night again. The specific night of this latitude, which is darker and heavier than the nights most people know, pressing down on the ship with a weight that feels almost physical. The men settle. Not into sleep exactly, into a kind of watchful stillness that the night produces in people who have spent long enough at sea to understand that darkness here is not the same as darkness on land. On land, the dark is passive. It sits where you put it. Out here, it moves. It has the same slow, purposeful quality as the water beneath the hull, and the men who live on that water have learned, without quite being able to explain it, to stay alert to what the dark might contain. And the weather it chose was frequently this. The whispers start early. Not the mutinous whispers of the previous night. Those had a direction, a specific weight, a target. These are different, quieter. They move between hammocks without destination, carrying the particular cargo of men who are trying to make the darkness smaller by filling it with words. He points at nothing, says one man quietly, nodding toward a shipmate across the hold whose eyes have been fixed on the same spot in the ceiling for longer than eyes fix on ceilings without reason. The others don't look. Looking acknowledges it. Old maritime folklore filled the dark with company. Not always welcome company, but company. Ghost ships that sailed without crew, moving against the wind because they had no need of it. You stand at the rail and look out. Shapes in the water that were too large to be anything the daylight hours would claim. Sounds in the rigging that sounded, if you were tired enough and cold enough and far enough from anything resembling land, like voices. The sailors of this era were not, as a rule, irrational men. They were men whose rationality operated in an environment that provided very little stable ground. When the difference between a creak that meant nothing and a creak that meant the hull was compromising was genuinely a matter of life and death, the mind learned to take creaks seriously. When weather could change from survivable to fatal in the time it took to climb from the hold to the deck, the mind learned to read signs. The superstitions were that reading, formalized. No whistling after sunset, because whistling called the wind, and the wind had already demonstrated that it did not need encouragement. No pointing at the moon, because the moon, out here, was one of the few consistent things in the world, and drawing attention to it seemed like exactly the kind of presumption that the sea punished. These were not the beliefs of people who had failed to think carefully. The water is dark and thick-looking, moving in slow, heavy swells that catch no light. They were the beliefs of people who had thought very carefully indeed, in conditions where the cost of being wrong was not embarrassment but drowning. You watch one man look up toward the porthole, catch himself, and look deliberately away. The habit is so practiced it barely registers as a gesture. The cat, which has been asleep on the captain's chair since mid-afternoon, sits up. It does not meow. It does not stretch or yawn or perform any of the usual transitions between sleep and waking. It simply sits up and turns its head toward the porthole and stares at something in the darkness outside with the fixed, unblinking attention that cats deploy when they have identified something that requires monitoring. Its tail moves once. The room notices. Rooms always notice when the cat notices something. There's a faint phosphorescence at the crest of each wave. A cold, blue-white shimmer that appears and disappears too quickly to be sure you saw it. A man near the door reaches for the small pouch at his belt, salt for scattering on the floor when the air needs clearing of things that shouldn't be in it. He doesn't scatter it yet. He just holds the pouch, his thumb pressed against the knot. The dead lantern, some sailors called it. A light that appeared at sea before a death. Not a ship's light, not St. Elmo's fire in its rational electrical explanation, but something smaller and more personal. A flicker that drifted at the edge of visibility and disappeared when you looked directly at it. Plasma, said the scientists who came later, ionized air, a natural consequence of electrical conditions in cold maritime weather. Which is almost certainly true and explains almost nothing about what it felt like to see it from a ship in the dark, in the middle of water that wanted you dead. You look toward the porthole. There is something there, or there was for the half-second before you looked. A faint luminescence at the edge of the glass that might be reflection and might not be. The man beside you has seen it too. The kind of thing that, on a night like this, you might decide you didn't see at all. His hand closes on the salt pouch. He opens it and tips a small amount onto the floor without drama. For peace, he says quietly, with the tone of someone performing a maintenance task rather than making a statement of belief. The others nod slightly. The gesture requires no endorsement to be effective. A 15th century navigator's logbook describes hearing voices in the wind during the longest stretches of open water. Not clearly, not in any language he could identify, but with the unmistakable cadence of speech. He wrote that he believed the sea repeated every word ever spoken above it, slowly, over years, releasing them back into the air when the conditions were right. He wrote this not as superstition, but as observation, in the same careful hand he used to record depth measurements and wind direction. You listen now. The wind moves through the rigging with its usual vocabulary of creaks and hums, and the occasional sharp note when it finds a rope at the right tension. These pirates were not strangers to this sea. And beneath it, or perhaps woven into it, or perhaps entirely constructed by a mind that has been on this ship long enough to start hearing what it expects to hear, there is something that has the shape of words without being words. The youngest pirate pulls his cloth tighter around his shoulders. "Do you hear it?" he whispers. Not quite a question. Nobody answers. This is the correct response. Answering would require acknowledging, and acknowledging would require deciding what it is, and deciding what it is would require being certain, and certainty is a resource this ship has not had in abundance for some time. The cat turns its head away from the porthole. Whatever it was watching has apparently resolved itself, or moved on, or was never there in the form that watching it implied. It settles back into its seated position and begins, with great deliberateness, to clean its left ear. They knew its moods the way you know the moods of a difficult colleague, not because the relationship was good, but because ignoring it had consequences. The man with the salt pouch closes it and puts it away. Somewhere above, the wind shifts register, dropping from its higher note to a lower one, the sound the rigging makes when the pressure changes and the cold is moving in a different direction. The men feel it through the wood before they hear it in the air. Shoulders settle. The quality of the silence changes from watchful to tired, which is an improvement. A voice from the darkest corner of the hold begins, quietly, to tell a story. Nothing elaborate. A port, a tavern, a meal that had bread in it, real bread, the kind that was still warm from the oven and left a mark on your hand when you squeezed it. The details are specific in the way that remembered pleasures are specific, held intact by longing when everything else blurs. Other voices add to it. A detail here, a correction there, the story growing in the telling until it is more collective than individual. a dream built from several people's separate memories of warmth. They knew how the water changed color before a storm. The ship moves through the dark. The cat sleeps. The salt stays in its pouch. And the night, which had been pressing close, retreats to a more manageable distance. Still present, still dark, still full of whatever it is full of. But held there, at the edge, by the oldest technology the ship carries. The sound of people talking themselves toward morning. The story fades mid-sentence. Not because the teller stops, he doesn't quite, but because something happens to the light, and the story becomes suddenly irrelevant, and everyone in the hold knows it at the same moment without anyone saying so. The light coming through the porthole has changed color. You climb to the deck without deciding to. The others follow, or they are already there, drawn up by the same instinct. The need to see whatever is producing that color with your own eyes, without glass between you and it. They knew the sound the wind made in the rigging when the temperature was about to drop another 5 degrees. The cold hits immediately, sharp and absolute, and nobody flinches. Nobody pulls a coat tighter. For once, the cold is not the thing that requires attention. Above the ship, the sky is on fire. Not literally. The sky is not on fire, and the part of your mind that remains practical knows this. But the sky is doing something that the word fire is the closest available approximation of. Ribbons of light move across the darkness in slow, deliberate waves, green deepening to gold, deepening to the faint blue-white at the edges where the color runs out. They shift continuously, folding back on themselves, stretching toward the horizon and contracting again, as though the sky is breathing and the breath is visible and the breath is luminous. The northern lights. The ship sits beneath them and the ship is silent. Every man on deck has stopped moving. They knew, without discussing it, exactly how bad tonight was going to get. Not frozen, not in the way the cold freezes things, but stopped, voluntarily, the way you stop when something requires the full allocation of your attention, and anything less would be a failure of the moment. The helmsman's hands rest on the wheel without gripping it. The man who was splicing a rope has set the rope down. The cat, which came up through the hatch behind you and settled on a coil of rope near the mast, watches the light with its tail curled around its paws and its eyes tracking the movement with the specific interest it reserves for things that move but cannot be caught. The ice on the rigging catches the aurora and holds it. Each frozen rope a filament of green, each crystal of salt on the rail a tiny mirror sending the light back upward. The sails, stiff with frost, glow with a cold luminescence that makes them look less like canvas and more like the sails of something that has no business being on water at all. The ship looks, from the outside, like something dreamed. Travelers of the northern oceans had been recording this sight for centuries before these men were born, and would continue recording it for centuries after. And in all that time, the descriptions would share a common feature: the failure of language to do what needed doing. Ghost fires, the Old Norse called them. Angels dancing, said the accounts from further south, written by men who had sailed north far enough to see something their theology had not prepared them for. And they went out anyway. Sky serpents. The burning of heaven. Words reaching for something they couldn't quite close around. A Hanseatic merchant traveling these waters in the early 1400s wrote that his crew fell to their knees when the lights appeared. He wrote it not as an example of their ignorance, but as a record of their response to something that deserved a response. The lights moved, he wrote, as oil moves on water. Slowly, with a weight and a purpose that made watching them feel less like observation and more like audience. You understand what he meant. One pirate near you crosses himself. A quick, private gesture, the hand moving before the decision is made, the body responding to something the mind is still processing. Another laughs, soft and slightly broken, the laugh of someone who has no other tool for this size of feeling. His voice trembles on the way out, and he doesn't apologize for it. Here is a small detail that tends to get overlooked in the more dramatic retellings. Nobody is paying attention to him. Everyone is paying attention to the sky. Some of the men claim to hear music in it. This is not as strange as it sounds, or rather it is exactly as strange as it sounds, and it happens anyway. Sailors across centuries have reported it. A sound beneath the aurora, faint and high. something between bells and the human voice, arriving from no direction and fading before it can be located. Scientists have offered explanations: electrical discharge, atmospheric pressure, the limits of auditory perception in extreme cold. The explanations are probably correct, and they don't help at all with what it feels like to stand on a frost-covered deck in the middle of the night and hear something that shouldn't be there and look up and see the sky doing what the sky is currently doing. You tilt your head. The wind moves through the rigging in its usual register. And beneath it, or perhaps behind it, in the frequency, the cold opens up when it has been cold enough for long enough. Something higher. Before sleep, on the coldest nights, when the cold had moved past uncomfortable and into genuinely threatening, some of these men rubbed their hands with whale oil. Something that resolves, briefly, into a tone. And then the wind shifts, and it's gone. The debate runs through the men the way it always runs through men who see the aurora in these waters. Good fortune, says one. The lights protect, they mark the sky's favor, no storm comes while they burn. Bad omen, says another. They mark a boundary, the place where the living should turn back, the edge of what the world permits. The two interpretations travel the length of the deck and blend together until neither has its original shape, and what remains is something simpler than either of them. Wonder. The plain, undefended kind. The kind that doesn't ask to be explained. The captain has come out. Thick, greasy, rendered from the blubber of animals larger than most of the ships in this fleet. He stands at the edge of the deck, not apart from his men, closer to them than he usually allows himself. His face tilted upward, his expression doing something it doesn't often do, which is nothing. No calculation, no assessment, no management of how it appears. Just a man looking at something too large to manage. Enjoy it, he says finally, to no one in particular and to everyone. His voice is quieter than usual, as though he doesn't want to take up more of the air than necessary. It will not last. He is right. It never does. The lights begin their slow fade. The green deepening toward darkness, the gold losing its edge, the movement slowing from waves to ripples to the faint suggestion of ripples, and then to a sky that is simply dark and full of stars. The men watch it go the way you watch something go when you know watching is all you can do. It worked as a primitive thermal layer, trapping the body's own heat beneath a slick, pungent seal against the wind. The light leaves the rigging first, then the sails, then the ice on the rail, each surface returning to its ordinary darkness in sequence, like lights in a building going off room by room. When it is gone, the cold comes back. It was always there. It never left. But the aurora had occupied the attention so completely that the cold had become background, and now it returns to foreground with the patient insistence of something that has been waiting its turn. The men stand still for another moment. Nobody wants to be the first to move. To move is to acknowledge that it is over, and nobody is quite ready for it to be over. Then someone exhales, long and slow, and the spell ends, and people begin again. One man tips his flask toward the sky, a toast, wordless to whatever that was. Another wipes his face with his sleeve. It smelled extraordinary. You don't look at why. The helmsman returns his hands to the wheel. The man with the rope picks it up again. The cat drops from its coil and walks back toward the hatch, tail high, its audience with the sky apparently concluded. Below, the hold is darker than before and quieter, and the story that was being told when the light changed has lost its thread entirely. Nobody asks for it to continue. Some things make other things unnecessary. Elijah, male, mid-30s. The aurora is gone and the dark that follows it is darker for the comparison. The men return to their hammocks with the subdued, slightly dazed quality of people who have just witnessed something that exceeded the available categories and are now required to return to a context that very much has not. The hold receives them. Not in a good way. The hammocks sway. The lantern burns at its usual inadequate level, illuminating roughly the area immediately around itself and leaving the rest to manage independently. Sleep should come easily tonight. It does not. You watch from the corner as the men lie in their hammocks and do not sleep. or sleep in the shallow, provisional way that is less rest than a pause in wakefulness. The eyes closing because they are tired and opening again because something won't quite allow the closing to hold. The bodies are exhausted. The exhaustion is not in question. But exhaustion and sleep are not the same thing, and on a ship that has been this cold for this long, the distance between them can become very wide. This is what the historians call the sleeplessness sickness. It doesn't arrive all at once. But when your hands are so cold that you can no longer feel whether you're holding something or not, vanity becomes a remarkably easy thing to set aside. It accumulates, the way the cold accumulates. Each night slightly worse than the last, the deficit compounding, until the line between waking and sleeping begins to blur at the edges, and then across the middle, and then the line isn't quite where it used to be, and the men on either side of it can no longer be entirely certain which side they're on. A Danish merchant voyage from roughly the same period produced a journal entry that survives in partial form, describing something the writer called the half-world. A state that arrived after enough weeks at sea in winter, where the crew moved through their duties without being fully present in. Them responding to the ship's demands with the automatic competence of long practice, while the part of the mind that was actually awake went somewhere else entirely. He described men answering questions they hadn't been asked, completing tasks they hadn't been assigned, stopping mid-action and staring at nothing for intervals they later couldn't account for. You can see the early stages of it here. One man near the mast counts. Quietly, barely audible, a rhythm of numbers that corresponds to nothing visible. Not the swaying of the hammocks, not the creak of the hull, not any pattern you can identify from outside. He has found something to count, and he is counting it, and the counting is what is keeping him in the room. You rub the oil in, you stop caring about the smell, and you go back to concentrating on the much more pressing problem of still being alive in the morning. His neighbor has asked him to stop twice. He has not stopped. He may not have heard. The sea invades everything given long enough. It invades the waking hours first, which is expected. The sound of it, the motion of it, the smell of it, these become the baseline of all experience, and anything that isn't the sea starts to feel temporary and slightly unreal. But then it invades the sleeping hours too. Men who fall asleep dream of solid ground and find that the ground tilts. They dream of walking and find that walking requires the same constant, unconscious adjustment that standing on a deck requires. The sea doesn't release its hold when consciousness does. Some of the crew dream only in gray after enough months of this. You can almost feel that residue now, thick and salt-sticky, catching the faint warmth your palms are trying to generate. The colors drain out slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, the way the sky loses light in the evening. The dreaming mind, deprived of variety, stops generating it. What remains is the sea in its actual colors, which are not vivid. A man wakes suddenly in the middle of the room, gasping, sitting upright, grabbing the side of his hammock with both hands. His eyes are wide and he is breathing fast, and he is looking around the hold with an expression that suggests it has taken him a moment to recognize it. That wherever he was before waking was more real than this, and the transition has been jarring. He was falling, he says, to no one in particular. Into the water. He lies back down. Within moments, or what seem like moments, time has become unreliable in here, another symptom of the same condition. His breathing slows again, and his face goes still. Asleep again, or something close enough. The wind takes the smell and carries it sideways into the dark. The others have registered it and returned to their own versions of not quite sleeping without comment. This happens. It has a name now in this hold, in the way that recurring things get named. Not a formal name, just an acknowledgement, a category. The falling dream. Everyone has had it. Nobody discusses it in daylight. Above deck, one of the watchmen has begun to fall asleep standing up. You can see it through the hatch, the slow forward tip of the head, the correction, the slow tip again, the body fighting a battle against itself with decreasing success. His legs are still planted. His hands are still on the rope. The sea doesn't notice. But the part of him that is supposed to be monitoring the horizon is somewhere else. somewhere warmer, and what remains is just the posture of vigilance without its content. Captains, the records show, responded to this in one of two ways. Some woke the man immediately and logged the lapse, treating it as a disciplinary matter, which it was technically in that a lookout who was asleep was not looking out and the ship was correspondingly less safe. Others looked away, making the same calculation the sea had taught them to make. That a man who could no longer stay awake had already stayed awake past the point where forcing him to continue served any useful purpose. That the ship needed a functional crew over the next week more than it needed a fully conscious one right now. This captain looked away. You watched him do it on your way back from the deck. A glance toward the sleeping watchman, a pause, a deliberate turn of the head in another direction. The decision made in a second, without drama. The man slept for 11 minutes. You counted. The sea never notices. Then something. The change in the wind, the shift in the ship's motion, some internal alarm that long experience had calibrated into the body, woke him, and he straightened and resumed watching the horizon with the guilty alertness of someone who knows they have been somewhere else and is hoping nobody noticed. The captain didn't mention it. Back in the hold, the counting man has stopped counting. His hands are still, his eyes closed, his breathing finally even. The dream, if it comes, will come in gray. The ground will tilt beneath whatever solid place his mind constructs for him. The sea will be there, patient and present, even in the places it isn't supposed to be. You close your own eyes for a moment and listen. The hull breathes. The hammocks sway. It just keeps moving, black and vast and completely indifferent to your skincare routine. The water moves against the wood in its slow, continuous conversation with the ship, a language that neither party fully understands, but that both have been speaking for long enough that the gaps don't matter. You realize, significantly more comfortable than anyone in this room. You are also, if you're being honest with yourself, still awake. Which puts you in good company, if not particularly restful company. The counting man's lips move faintly in his sleep. Whatever he's counting now, only he can hear it. Elijah, male, mid-30s. The storm announces itself the way the worst things do. Not with drama, but with a change in the quality of the quiet. You feel it first in the hull. A different motion, deeper and slower than the ordinary roll, the kind that comes from swells that have been building for a long time across a long distance and have arrived with everything they accumulated on the way. The lanterns swing differently. You find the hatch. The ropes take on a different note. The men in their hammocks stir without waking, their bodies registering the change before their minds do. The sea's intentions communicated through wood and rope and the soles of sleeping feet. Then the wind arrives. It doesn't build gradually. It is simply absent, and then it is present, and the present version is enormous. A sound like something tearing, the sails snapping from their frozen stillness into violent, straining life. The rigging screaming in a register that the ship hasn't produced until now. The cold rain that follows is not rain in any comfortable sense of the word. It arrives horizontally, at speed, each drop hitting exposed skin with the specific impact of something that has decided to cause harm. The hold empties in seconds. You have never seen men move this fast. The exhaustion that has been accumulating for days disappears. Not gone exactly, but overridden. The body's emergency systems taking the controls away from the parts that were tired and handing them to the parts that understand survival. It's a small wooden square set into the deck, and the light spilling up through it is faint and yellow. The color of things that are trying their best under difficult circumstances. They are on deck before they are fully awake, coats half-fastened, eyes still adjusting, already grabbing ropes and bracing against the tilt of the deck with the instinctive competence of people who have done this before and know precisely what it costs to do it too slowly. The ship is fighting. There is no other word for what a vessel does in a storm like this. Not sailing, not navigating, not moving through the water so much as arguing with it. Each wave a separate negotiation conducted at volume. The deck pitches to a degree that makes horizontal a matter of opinion. Barrels that were secured yesterday have become unsecured by the violence of the night and slide with each roll, each one a moving hazard in an environment that already has enough of those. Seawater comes over the bow in sheets, freezing almost instantly on contact with the deck, every surface becoming a new version of treacherous. The captain is at the wheel. He didn't need to be told. He was there before the order could have been given, his hands on the wood, his feet planted in the stance of a man who has made his peace with the fact that the deck is not going to stay where he puts his weight and has adjusted accordingly. His voice, when it comes, carries over the wind with the specific quality of a voice that has been trained by years of needing to be heard in exactly these conditions. The smell reaches you before the warmth does. Hold fast. 2 words. The men hear them and the men hold. The seas, sailors of this era wrote, could sense fear in a crew. This was not mysticism, or not only mysticism. It was observation. A frightened crew made small errors, and small errors in a storm compounded quickly into large ones, and large ones in a storm had a way of becoming final ones. The crew that held its nerve, that moved deliberately, that communicated clearly, that did not allow the scale of what was happening to override the capacity to respond to it, was the crew that gave the ship its best chance. These men hold their nerve, not without effort, which tells you something important about what's waiting below. You can see the effort, in the white knuckles on the ropes, in the set of the jaw against the spray, in the deliberate steadiness of movement that must be chosen, consciously, against the body's louder preference for panic. One man slips on the ice deck and goes down hard, his shoulder catching the mast, the sound of the impact audible even over the storm. He is on his feet before anyone reaches him. He doesn't pause. The storm doesn't pause either, and the storm has made clear that pausing is not among the available options. There is laughter. It comes from somewhere near the bow. Sharp, wild, the specific frequency of laughter that has nothing to do with anything being funny and everything to do with the human mind's response to the discovery that it is still present, still functioning, still here, in conditions that suggested the possibility of not being here had become quite concrete. It spreads briefly, that laughter. A few voices joining the first before the wind takes it, and the next wave requires everyone's full attention again. The old accounts describe this. Sailors laughing in storms. You climb down. Not at anything. Just laughing, the way pressure releases through whatever opening is available, the way the body chooses, sometimes, an improbable expression for an unbearable feeling. Defy it, one man calls out over the wind, to no one in particular. Let it test us. The others don't cheer. A cheer would require breath that nobody can spare. But something passes through the crew that has the shape and function of a cheer without the sound. A collective straightening. A shared decision, made without discussion, to continue being the kind of people who are still here. Hours pass in the way that storm hours pass. Not in sequence, not as discrete units of time, but as a continuous present tense from which the concept of before and after have been temporarily removed. You are bailing, and then you are not bailing, and then you are holding a rope, and then you are somewhere else, and then the rope is back. The cold and the wet have merged into a single condition that covers everything. The air changes immediately. Your hands stopped feeling like your hands some time ago and have become tools that you operate at a slight remove. And then, without the courtesy of a transition, the storm is less. Not gone. Not over, but less. The wind dropping half a register, the waves losing their top edge, the rain thinning from assault to presence. The ship steadies, by degrees, back towards something that contains the possibility of being survived. The men feel it before they can confirm it. A loosening in the chest, the body beginning to release the breath it has been holding for hours. They slump where they stand. There is no celebration. There is barely language. Warmer, yes, but warmer in the way that a crowded elevator is warmer. One man sits down on the deck with his back against the mast and his head against the wood and closes his eyes. And the deck is freezing and wet and tilted, and none of that is the point. The point being that sitting down is now a thing that is possible. Another wipes his face with a sleeve that is as wet as his face. A third looks up at the thinning clouds with an expression of exhausted neutrality, as though he is withholding judgment on the whole experience pending further evidence. A single thread of pale light appears at the horizon. It is not dawn. It is hours too early for dawn. But it is light, thin and cold and unconvincing. And it is there, which means the sky has not closed entirely, which means the worst is past, which means that the calculations the storm forced everyone to make silently and continuously throughout the night have resolved, at least for now, in the direction of continuing. The captain releases the wheel. His hands, when he opens them, are shaking. He closes them again immediately, before anyone can see. Technically an improvement? Or perhaps he doesn't mind who sees. It's difficult to tell with him whether the privacy is for his benefit or theirs. The ship groans. A long structural sound, the vessel taking inventory of itself, assessing what the storm has taken and what it has left. The answer this time is enough. Enough mast. Enough sail. Enough hull between the crew and the water. Enough! The men begin to move again, slowly, taking stock alongside the ship. Checking lines, assessing damage, doing the quiet arithmetic of survival with the methodical patience of people who have done this before and expect to do it again and have made a kind of peace with that expectation. Not something you'd choose. The pale light at the horizon holds. And the sea, which has been making its argument at full volume for hours, drops its voice to something that is almost calm. Elijah. Male, mid-30s. The calm that follows the storm is not the same calm that came before it. The earlier stillness had been passive, the sea simply undecided, the weather holding its breath between intentions. This calm is different. It has been earned, or rested, or survived into, and it carries the particular quality of things that come after great effort. Quieter than ordinary quiet, heavier, the silence of a room after an argument that has finally exhausted itself. The sea is freezing again. You notice it first at the edges. The water nearest the hull losing its movement in small increments, the surface tension changing, the waves flattening and slowing and then not quite recovering between swells. Then the ice appears, not the large dramatic sheets of before, but a thin, continuous skin forming across the water in every direction, spreading outward from the ship as though the vessel itself is the source of the cold, which it is not, but which is how it looks. By morning, the world is white. The ceiling is low enough that you feel it without touching it, and the space stretches away into dimness in both directions, broken up by barrels, coiled rope, and the slow, swaying shapes of men in hammocks. Not the violent white of the storm. That was white in motion, white with velocity and noise. This is white as stillness, white as the inside of something closed. The sky and the sea have matched themselves to each other in a shared colorlessness that removes the horizon entirely, leaving the ship suspended in a space with no edges and no reference points, floating in the middle of a sphere of pale nothing. The sound changes too. The hull has been producing its vocabulary of creaks and groans for the entire voyage, and you have become so accustomed to it that you stopped hearing it the way you stop hearing a clock. Now, in the freeze, the sounds soften. The wood still moves, the ship still breathes, but the noise of it is muffled by the ice forming against the hull, insulated, reduced to something lower and more interior, as though the ship has started speaking only to itself. One explorer, writing of a morning like this one, called it waking inside a frozen breath. You feel the accuracy of that. This is where the pirates actually lived. The air is not merely cold. It has a substance, a weight, a presence that makes breathing feel like an exchange rather than a reflex. You take something from it and give something back, and neither party is entirely satisfied with the arrangement. The pirates move with new caution. Their boots test each plank before committing weight to it, the frost having made the deck a surface where confidence is specifically contraindicated. They speak less than usual, which was already not much. The cold has reached the point where words cost something. The breath required to produce them, the exposure of the warm interior of the mouth and throat to air that does not deserve access to warm things. Two men lean over the rail and look into the water alongside the hull. What they see is not water. Ice plates have formed in the night, large flat sections of frozen sea drifting in slow, ponderous contact with the hull, producing the hollow ringing sound you remember from before. But slower now, deeper, the knocking of things too heavy to be hurried. The sound resonates through the planks and into the deck and into the soles of your boots and up through you until you can feel it in your back teeth. Not on open decks under dramatic skies. The risk is not dramatic. It announces itself in no particular way. But the men at the rail know it, and you know it from their faces. The ice does not need to move quickly to be dangerous. It only needs to be heavy, and to press, and to be patient. A ship caught between two large plates of ice, squeezed from both sides simultaneously, can lose the argument about its own structural integrity in minutes. The wood that has been groaning companionably for weeks can decide, under sufficient lateral pressure, to simply stop. A man produces a pole and begins pushing ice away from the hull. A task with the Sisyphean quality of all tasks performed in freezing conditions, in that the ice returns approximately as fast as it is removed. But the pushing must continue regardless, because the alternative to pushing is not pushing, and not pushing is not an option. Others join him. The work is slow and cold and produces very little immediate result and is done with the steady, joyless competence of men who have understood that useful work and satisfying work are not the same category and have stopped expecting them to be. Somewhere in the distance, not close but not far enough, a sound arrives that makes everyone on deck look up simultaneously. Not in candlelit cabins with maps and compasses and significant hats. A crack. Deep and drawn out, the sound that ice makes when it fails. Not a sharp snap, but a long, groaning fracture, the noise of something under stress finally acknowledging the stress. It comes from the northeast, which is the direction more ice is coming from, and it means the ice is moving, which means the ship needs to move first. The captain is already at the wheel. Sailors who spent enough time in these waters developed what they called the ear for ice, an ability to read the sounds the frozen sea produced and extract information from them. The high whistle meant ice approaching. The low groan meant ice fracturing. The silence meant ice thinking, which was the most dangerous sound of all, because ice thinking was ice making a decision, and the decision was never one that benefited the ship. You can hear the thinking now. Between the other sounds, the wind, the hull, the men with their poles, there is a silence with a texture to it, a pregnant stillness that suggests the ice knows where the ship is and is considering its options. Here, in this narrow, creaking, salt-soaked dark, packed together like cargo that had decided to breathe. The helmsman makes a correction so small it is barely visible. The ship responds, reluctantly, turning its nose away from the largest of the approaching plates by a degree that seems insufficient and may be all that is available. The men work. The poles push. The ice rings against the hull. Somewhere below, a strange and small thing is happening. One pirate sits on an upturned barrel near the mainmast with a coin in his hand. A small one, worn nearly smooth, its original markings reduced to suggestions. He holds it for a moment, says nothing, and then flicks it out over the rail. It skitters across the surface of the nearest ice plate, ringing faintly, a small, bright sound against the vast gray quiet. It slides to the edge of the plate and disappears into the gap between the ice. The hammocks hang close enough to touch, swaying gently out of phase with each other, each one creaking at its own pitch. An offering, or an acknowledgement, or simply the need to do something that is not pushing a pole, to make a gesture that is not practical, that operates in the register of faith rather than physics, that says to whatever is out there, "We know you are larger than we are." We are not confused about that. We are simply still here. The others watch the coin disappear. Nobody speaks. In the hold below, the loot sits in its chest. Coins, silver cups, a gold chain, the material evidence of everything this voyage was supposed to be about. One of the men went down earlier and opened the chest and looked at it and closed it again without touching anything. The gold looked pale in the cold light. Together they make a sound that is not quite music but functions like it. a slow, layered lullaby built entirely from rope friction and exhaustion. Inert. The temperature that made breath visible had done something to treasure, revealed it as what it actually was, which was metal, which was cold, which was heavy, which was none of the things the mind dressed it in when the weather was better. You cannot eat gold. You cannot burn it for warmth. It cannot be stuffed into a coat or rubbed into hands or shared between two men pressing their backs together in the dark. The men who have spent their lives pursuing it are burning pieces of their own ship to stay warm. One man tends a small iron bowl near the mast, feeding it scraps of broken wood with the careful attention of someone nursing the last resource available, which is what he is doing. The heat it produces is negligible. The fire it permits itself is minimal. A few inches of flame that the wind would extinguish immediately if the bowl were not shielded on three sides by men crouching around it. But it is there. You stop for a moment just to listen. It exists. It produces light and a small, honest warmth, and the proof that something is still burning, which has always been, on this ship, the thing that matters most. All the riches in the world, one man says quietly, watching the flame. And we're burning bits of our own ship. He doesn't say it bitterly. He says it the way you state a fact that has become interesting rather than painful, with the detached curiosity of someone who has been in the situation long enough that the irony has moved past sharp and into something more philosophical. The others nod. The flame holds. The ice presses. The coin is somewhere below the surface now, sinking through the dark water toward whatever the dark water contains, carrying whatever weight a coin can carry when it is offered freely into the sea. It's the kind of sound that doesn't ask anything of you. The ship pushes on. Elijah, male, mid-30s. The ice releases the ship the way a difficult person ends an argument. Not with any particular grace, and without acknowledging that it was ever holding on. One morning you wake to a sound that is different from all the sounds that have come before it, and it takes a moment to identify the difference because the difference is absence. The hollow ringing of ice against the hull is gone. Or not gone. Reduced, intermittent, the plates drifting past rather than pressing in, the current having shifted overnight into something that is, for the first time in what feels like a very long time, not working against the ship. The water is moving. Real water. Dark and cold and entirely itself. Not the half-frozen, plate-laden near-solid of the past days, but actual sea, actual waves, small and tentative at first, as though testing whether the permission to move again is genuine. It is genuine. The ship feels it before the men do. A loosening in the hull's argument with the world. A return to the familiar negotiation of wave and wood that is hard work and always has been, but is at least the right kind of hard work. The kind the ship was built for. It simply continues, regardless. The men come on deck and stand there. For a moment, nobody moves to do anything. They look at the water, at the retreating ice, at the horizon, which has returned, has come back from wherever horizons go when the world turns white, sitting in its correct position between the sea and the sky like something that was always there and was simply waiting to be noticed again. The sun appears. It is not impressive as suns go. It is pale and low and produces the kind of light that a more demanding audience might reject as insufficient. It sits above the horizon with the tentative quality of something that has been away for a while and is not entirely certain of its welcome. But it is there. Now, here is the part that surprises most people. Its light falls on the deck and on the frost-glazed ropes and on the upturned faces of the men, and the faces receive it with an attention that the sun, in warmer places, in more comfortable circumstances, almost never receives. One man closes his eyes. Just that. Just closes his eyes and turns his face toward the pale warmth and stands there. Still, his expression doing something complicated and private that you look away from out of a courtesy that feels necessary even here, even now. The ice that remains drifts past in pieces. Smaller now, irregular. The large sheets having fractured and separated during the night into something the ship can navigate around rather than through. They knock against the hull in the old familiar way, but lightly, without intention, the sound more like punctuation than threat. The men push the nearest ones away with poles, and the poles feel different in their hands now. The work easier not because the ice has changed much, but because everything else has. A rope snaps somewhere above, not from damage, but from thawing unevenly, the ice that held it releasing at one end before the other, the sudden tension too much for the frozen fiber. Two men climb to fix it without being asked, moving through the rigging with a speed that wasn't available to them yesterday and that the cold is going to reclaim if the temperature drops again tonight, but which is available right now, and right now is what they're working with. The sound of them working, the specific sounds of the ship being tended rather than survived, fills the morning air with something that functions as its own kind of warmth. Hammocks were not invented for comfort. An explorer who had survived a winter similar to this one wrote afterward about the first real sunrise. He called it a wound of light in a frozen world, which is accurate in the way that only slightly excessive language can be accurate. The light does arrive like something breaking open, like a seal giving way, like a thing that was held back releasing all at once into the space where the dark was. He also wrote that his crew did not cheer when the ice released them. He had expected cheering. He had imagined, during the worst of it, that when the moment came, there would be something appropriately dramatic. Voices raised, hats thrown, the audible relief of men who had survived a thing that could have gone the other way. Instead, his crew did what the crew of this ship is doing now. They stood in the new light and were quiet, and the quiet said more than cheering would have, because it was the quiet of people who understood what they were feeling and chose not to reduce it. One of the pirates begins to sing. It starts small, barely singing, more a continuation of breathing with more shape to it. A melody that might be a song he heard in a port whose name he might not remember anymore, or might be something his mind has assembled from pieces of several songs during the long weeks when there was nothing else to assemble. The voice is rough and the pitch is approximate, and neither of these things matters at all. They were invented because sleeping on the deck of a moving ship was genuinely dangerous. A second voice joins it. Then a third. The song has no particular words, or if it has words, they are not the point. The point is the sound of it, the fact of it, the proof that the voices are still here and still capable of something that is not shouting into a storm. It moves across the deck in the thin morning air, and the men who are not singing listen to it with the same attention they gave the aurora, which is to say, complete and wordless and grateful for the distraction from their own thoughts. The captain watches from the doorway of his cabin. He does not join the singing. He does not comment on it. He stands with his arms at his sides and his face arranged into its usual careful neutrality, and watches his crew stand in the thin sunlight and sing an approximate song about nothing in particular. And his expression, when you catch it at an angle the careful neutrality doesn't fully cover, is something that might be relief or might be something older and harder to name. He goes back inside without speaking. The gull appears sometime in the late morning, a single bird circling the mast twice before angling away toward the southeast. One unexpected roll, and a sleeping man became a rolling man, and then a man with bruised ribs, and then a man who wasn't going to be useful for the next 3 days. The men watch it with the specific intensity they reserve for signs. Whether it actually indicates anything about the proximity of land is a question the bird is not available to answer. But the watching of it and the discussing of what it means provides the crew with something to do with their hope, which is an important service. "Land soon," one man says. Nobody confirms it. Nobody disagrees. Below deck, the air still smells of everything the voyage has deposited in it. Tar and salt and the residue of weeks of human endurance in close quarters. But someone has opened the forward hatch, and through it a thread of cold, clean, outside air moves slowly through the hold. It finds the hammocks and the barrels and the carved charms on the beams, and it carries with it, faint but real, the smell of open water. The smell of somewhere else. The cook produces something from the galley that he calls stew with more confidence than the contents quite support, and the men eat it with a willingness they haven't brought to meals in some time. Hammocks solve this by suspending the body in a cradle of rope that moved with the ship rather than against it. The hardtack is still hardtack. The beef is still the beef. But the bowl is warm, and the hands around it are slightly warmer than they were yesterday, and the horizon is back in its correct position, and the sun, pale and unconvincing as it is, has chosen to remain present through the morning. These are not large things. On a different ship, in different waters, in a different season, none of them would be worth noting. But here, after everything the cold has taken, and the ice has taken, and the storm has taken, and the dark has taken, they are each of them enormous. They are each of them proof that the accounting has come out, this time, on the side of continuing. The song has faded by now, the voices dropping away one by one as the men return to their work, until only one remains. The original voice still going, the melody still approximate, the point still not the words. He sings until he doesn't, and then the deck is quiet again, and the quiet is a different kind than all the others the ship has produced. It is the quiet of something beginning. The sea tilted, the hammock tilted with it, not ending, not surviving into stillness. Something actually beginning, the ship moving through open water, the horizon ahead, the ice behind, the sun overhead doing what it can, which today is enough. Elijah, male, mid-30s. The ship moves south, not quickly. It has never moved quickly, and the weeks of cold and storm and ice have left it with the particular deliberateness of something that has been through a great deal and is proceeding carefully as a result. But it moves. The water beneath the hull is dark and open and real, and the sound it makes against the wood is the old, familiar sound, the one that was always there before the ice changed everything. And hearing it again is like hearing your own name after a long time in a place where nobody knew it. The temperature is still cold. This is worth saying plainly, because the temptation is to describe what follows the ice as warmth, and it isn't warmth, not yet, not in any way that a thermometer would ratify. The air still bites. The sleeper stayed, more or less, where he'd been put. The ropes are still stiff in the mornings. Breath still clouds. But the cold has changed in quality, the way pain changes when it begins to recede. It's still there, still present, still making its usual demands, but it has lost the absolute quality it had at the worst of it. It has become a condition rather than a verdict. The men feel the difference even if they can't name it. They move differently. Not faster. They are still too exhausted for faster, but with less of the rigid economy of people conserving every degree of warmth for essential functions. Elbows unlock. Shoulders drop a fraction. The permanent squint against wind-driven cold softens slightly around the edges. Pirates adopted them quickly. Small things. The kind of things you would never notice unless you had been watching long enough to know what the alternative looked like. You have been watching long enough. The days take on a rhythm that is gentler than anything the voyage has produced until now. Not easy, not comfortable, not the rhythm of people who have arrived anywhere, but the rhythm of people who are moving toward somewhere rather than merely persisting in place. Watch rotations happen. Meals are produced and consumed. The cook hums in the galley. The cat occupies its preferred positions around the deck in rotation, conducting its inspections, accepting tribute from whoever offers it. The sea, for its part, behaves. This is not guaranteed and is not taken for granted. A sensible decision, which was not always their strong suit. The men watch the horizon and the sky and the water with the attention that the past weeks have made permanent. The sea has demonstrated what it is capable of, and that knowledge doesn't dissolve when the weather improves. It settles instead into a background awareness, a low-frequency vigilance that will probably never entirely leave them, that will likely follow them ashore and into taverns and into sleep for years afterward. The sea's lasting gift to everyone who has spent enough time on it to understand what it actually is. But the horizon stays clear. The evenings arrive earlier than they did at the worst of it, the sky holding its light a little longer each day, a change so gradual it can only be perceived in retrospect. You notice one evening that it is light at an hour when last week it was dark, and the noticing feels like a small victory over something that had been winning consistently. The men gather on deck in the evenings now, which they did not do before, the nights having been too cold for anything that wasn't strictly necessary. They gather loosely, without agenda, the way people gather when the pressure that kept them apart has reduced enough to make proximity feel like a choice rather than a survival strategy. Someone produces a flask, as someone always produces a flask, but the drinking is slower tonight, more considered, less like medication, and more like the thing it nominally is. A toast is made. It is not elaborate. The man who makes it, one of the older ones, his beard still carrying the remnants of frost in its lower reaches, his eyes carrying the remnants of everything else, holds his cup up toward the darkening sky and says simply, "To the ones who did not freeze." You reach out and touch the edge of the nearest one. The others echo it, not loudly, not with the performed emotion of people making a moment of something, just quietly, the words going up into the cooling air and disappearing, which is where words about the dead belong on a ship, released into the element that took them, acknowledged and then let go, because there is still a ship to sail and a destination that has not been reached yet, and the living require the attention of the living. The cups come down. The evening continues. Later, when the dark has fully arrived and the stars have come out over water calm enough to reflect them, you find yourself at the stern, looking back at where the ship has been. The ice is not visible. It was never visible from this far south. It was always a matter of position and direction, and the slow, accumulating evidence of cold. But you can feel its absence, which is its own kind of presence. The fog appears at the horizon as the night deepens. Not the threatening fog of the worst days, not the whiteout that erased direction and depth and the difference between sea and sky, but something softer. A mist that glows faintly under the moon, gathering along the water's surface without covering it entirely. The moonlight passing through it in diffuse silvered bands that move with the water beneath. The fabric is stiff with salt, rough against your fingers, gritty in the way that everything on this ship is gritty, as though the sea has worked its way into the fiber of every object and made itself at home. The men who are still awake see it. Ghostlight, one says, not with fear, not with the tightness that superstition produced in the darkest nights, but with a kind of affectionate recognition, the tone of someone naming a thing they have seen before and have made their peace with. Each man takes it as he needs to take it: omen, reflection, weather, memory. The sea is generous with its mysteries and asks only that you bring your own interpretation, which everyone here has. The captain comes out for the last time tonight. He stands at the rail without his coat fastened, which is new, a small concession to the marginally warmer air that would have been unthinkable a week ago and now is simply true. He looks at the fog. He looks at the stars in the water. He looks at his crew, gathered in their loose evening configuration along the deck, and something in his face settles. Not relaxes, exactly. He's not a man who relaxes, but settles, finds a resting position it hasn't occupied in weeks. He nods. You can feel the weight of the man inside it, the slow rise and fall of his breathing. Not at anyone in particular. Not at you, though you are watching. Just a nod. The private acknowledgement of a private accounting conducted quietly at the rail of his own ship, the conclusion of which appears to be, enough survived. Enough remains. The calculation comes out. He goes back inside. The door closes softly. Below deck, the hammocks are filling. The lanterns are burning lower. The sounds of the ship at night, the familiar vocabulary of creak and sigh and the slow percussion of water on wood, settle into their rhythm, and the rhythm is the same one that has accompanied every night of this voyage, unchanged by storm or ice or the mutinous arithmetic of desperate men. Some of these men had lined their hammocks with whatever they could find. The ship has been talking all along. You understand it better now. You move to the rail and rest your hands on the wood, which is cool but not cold, or cold but bearable. The same cold it always is, but received differently now, without the resistance that the worst of it required. The water moves in long, slow swells that catch the moonlight and release it again, each wave a brief illumination and then dark, and then the next wave and the next light and the darkness between them, which is not frightening anymore, which is simply the sea doing what the sea does, which is continue. You breathe in. The air tastes of salt and open water and the distant, faint sweetness of somewhere that is not this. somewhere warmer and closer to land than any point this ship has occupied in weeks. You can't smell land. Not really, not yet, not from here. But the air has stopped smelling exclusively of cold and misery, which is a start. The fog thickens gently, wrapping the ship in something that softens all the edges. The line between hull and water, between water and sky, between the ship's noise and the ocean's silence, between the end of this and the beginning of whatever comes after it. Stolen sailcloth. Everything becomes a little less distinct, a little more continuous. The boundary between things, which has been very clear and very cold for a long time, blurs into something more forgiving. Below you, the ship breathes. The men breathe with it, their sleep settling into the deep, genuine kind that the body has been owed for weeks and is finally being permitted to collect. The kind where the dreams, whatever they contain, arrive in color, and the ground in them stays level, and the sea, if it appears at all, is the sea from a distance, seen from somewhere safe, which is a version of the sea that exists for people who have survived it. The cat is asleep on the captain's chair. The ember somewhere below still glows. The fog moves across the water, glowing faintly under the moon, and the ship moves through it, and the cold is still there, but it hums now rather than bites. A low, continuous note beneath everything else. The sound of the world at its most fundamental temperature, which is cold, which has always been cold, which will be cold long after this ship and everyone on it has become part of the story that the sea tells about itself. But not tonight. Tonight the ship is warm enough. A strip of animal fur acquired through means nobody was asking about. Tonight the men are sleeping. Tonight, the water is open and the stars are in it, and the fog moves across the surface of everything like a hand smoothing something down, like the world making a final adjustment before it decides that this is, for now, enough. You rest your hands on the rail and feel the ship move beneath them. The sea breathes. You breathe with it, in and out. And the cold, which was never going anywhere, stays where it is. At the edge of things where it belongs, and lets the night be what the night can be, when the worst of it is past and the rest of it is ahead, and the ship is still here. And so, improbably, are you. The water moves under the moon. The fog holds its light, anything that could hold a little warmth against the body through the night. And somewhere ahead, unhurried and certain, morning is already deciding to happen. The result smelled of smoke and sweat and salt, which is to say it smelled exactly like everything else down here, only more concentrated. Sleep came in fragments. 2 hours, maybe 3. Never deeply, not when every creak could mean a leak, and every unfamiliar sound could mean someone had decided that now was the moment to settle an old disagreement. The men slept near their weapons. Not out of paranoia, exactly. Out of the same practical logic that keeps your phone on the nightstand. You want the thing within reach. Just in case. A man shifts in his hammock, muttering something that doesn't resolve into words. Another snorts, turns, sets his hammock spinning lazily before it steadies. Somewhere above, water drips through the seams of the deck and finds a bucket with a steady, patient plink. The ship rocks. The hammocks sway. The sound continues, low and layered and relentless, like the sea itself has learned to hum. You go deeper. The passage narrows as you move forward, the beams dropping lower, the air growing heavier with each step. Your boots stick slightly to the damp floorboards, not dramatically, just enough to remind you that moisture has claimed everything down here and has no intention of giving it back. The smell thickens. Tar and salt and the particular staleness of air that has been breathed too many times by too many people in too small a space. This is the bottom of the world as far as this ship is concerned. A single lantern hangs from a hook, its flame reduced to something barely worth the word. The glow it produces is less illumination than suggestion. A faint amber wash that catches the edges of things without fully revealing them. Barrels line the walls. Ropes coil in the corners. And between them, In whatever gaps remained after the ship had been loaded with everything it needed to function, men have arranged themselves to sleep. Journals from sailors of the late Middle Ages describe the lower deck in terms that don't require much imagination. It was a haven when the weather above was trying to kill you, and a prison every other hour of the day. The wind couldn't reach you down here, which was the good news. The air couldn't move either, which was the bad news delivered immediately afterward. But here is what those journals also note, and what tends to get left out of the more heroic accounts of seafaring life. Sound echoed down here in ways it didn't above deck. A whisper carried the full length of the hold. A cough announced itself to everyone, which meant that the lower deck, for all its physical discomfort, became the social center of the ship. Alliances were formed in the dark between one hammock and the next. Grudges were nursed in low voices. Secrets moved through the space like drafts, invisible, persistent, finding every gap. You crouch near a pile of blankets stacked against the hull. The fabric is extraordinary in its variety. Wool patches sewn onto linen, linen patches sewn onto canvas, the whole assemblage held together by thread and determination and what appears to be genuine spite. You can see through parts of it. You choose not to think too hard about how cold that would feel against skin at 3 a.m. when the ship is making its worst noises. In the far corner, a boy sits with his knees pulled to his chest, back against a barrel, eyes open but not quite focused on anything in the room. He looks perhaps 15, perhaps younger. Ships like this kept young hands aboard for the work nobody else wanted. Cleaning, fetching, patching, disappearing into spaces too small for a grown man. For boys like him, the lower deck was everything at once. Bedroom and classroom and introduction to a world that had decided to be unkind to him quite early. You press your hand flat against the hull. The wood is cold and damp, faintly vibrating with the movement of the water on the other side. You feel every wave as a tremor, not frightening exactly, but constant. A reminder that there is nothing between you and the ocean except a few inches of timber and the collective optimism of everyone aboard. Carved into the beam just above the nearest hammock. A small symbol, rough-edged, cut with something sharp and not quite steady. A charm. The kind of mark a man makes when words feel insufficient and doing nothing feels worse. There are others nearby. Different shapes, different hands, layered over years of voyages by men who all wanted the same thing and expressed it in whatever private language they had available. And then there is the ember. In one account, half folklore, half fact, the line between them worn thin by salt air, crews kept a single coal alive through the night in a covered bowl of sand. They called it the heart of the ship. It glowed faintly in the dark, a point of red warmth no bigger than a thumbnail, tended through the watches like something sacred. If it went out, the sailors said, bad luck was coming. You look around the dim space and think about what that ember must have meant. Not the heat, it produced almost none. But the light, the proof that something was still burning, that the cold hadn't won yet. In a place like this, that distinction mattered more than you might think from the comfort of wherever you're lying right now. The ship breathes around you. The lantern trembles. The boy in the corner has closed his eyes. Below the waterline, the ocean moves in long, slow pulses. And the ember, if it's there at all, keeps quietly glowing. Eventually, you climb back up. Not because it's warmer above deck. It isn't, not even slightly. But because the air below has reached the kind of density that makes breathing feel like a conscious effort. You surface through the hatch into the pale early light, and the cold hits your face like a door swung open by someone who didn't know you were standing there. The crew is beginning to stir. And what they're wearing tells you everything about where they've been and how long they've been there. Nothing looks uniform. Nothing looks intentional exactly. What you're looking at is the textile history of every ship they've ever raided, every port they've ever passed through, every decision made at 3 a.m. when the alternative was freezing. Documents from the 15th century describe the standard layering logic of sailors in cold water. Wool directly against the skin, then linen, then something heavier on top. Canvas, hide, whatever could be made to approximate a coat. Pirates followed the same principle, with the additional creative freedom of not particularly caring where the materials came from. Which is how you end up with a crew dressed like this. One man wears what might once have been a priest's robe, cut down and resewn into something vaguely coat-shaped, its embroidered hem now doing duty as a collar. Another has layered so many different fabrics that his silhouette has become genuinely abstract. A third is wrapped in something that started life as a tapestry. You can still make out the lower half of what appears to be a hunting scene along his left shoulder. They look less like a crew and more like a collection of things a very cold wardrobe decided to organize itself into. And then there is the scarf. One man adjusts a length of bright red fabric around his neck, frayed at both edges, thick enough to have survived several owners. He winds it twice, tucks the ends under his chin, and mutters something about keeping the devil's fingers off his throat. It sounds like a joke. His expression suggests it isn't entirely one. Sailors believed the cold carried spirits. Not metaphorically, literally. Invisible things that crept into a man's lungs while he slept and took up residence there. A scarf wasn't just insulation. It was a barrier. A physical declaration that this particular airway was occupied and not available for haunting. You would think this sounds unreasonable, and then you would spend one night on this ship and revise your position considerably. Beyond the scarves and the layered wool, there were other measures. Men stuffed their clothes with moss when they had it, with straw when they didn't, with shredded sailcloth when everything else had run out. The goal was simple: stop the wind from reaching skin. The method was whatever worked. And on the coldest voyages, particularly among crews operating near the northern whaling routes, some men rubbed seal fat onto their faces and hands before nightfall. Thick, dense, aggressively unpleasant in every sensory dimension. But it worked. It held the body's heat against the skin like a primitive second layer, keeping frostbite from the fingers and the face through the worst hours of the night. The smell, by all accounts, was remarkable. Nobody complained. Or rather, nobody complained about the smell. Everything else was fair game. Scholars still argue about whether pirates in northern waters managed to stockpile furs from raided ships, or whether their lives were simply too chaotic for that kind of forward planning. The evidence suggests both, depending on the crew and the season. What the evidence agrees on is this: no one who survived a northern winter at sea went into the next one underprepared. The cold had a way of making its expectations very clear. You watch a man beat his coat against the mast, not out of frustration, though frustration is present, but because the fabric froze overnight and needs to be softened before it can be worn. The sound it makes is sharp and flat, like someone hitting a board. He does it methodically, working from the shoulders down until the cloth begins to move again. The pitch and tar sealing the hull cracked in temperatures like these. Wind found the gaps. Seawater came in, and whatever it touched, it eventually froze. Clothes left unattended overnight turned rigid. Boots became architecture. Ropes went from flexible to structural without asking permission. The ship, on its worst mornings, looked like a wardrobe that had been left outside for a season and had made its peace with the situation. Around you, the crew finishes the slow work of making themselves functional. They pull things on, tie things closed, tuck edges in. The colors, though faded, muted reds, salt-bleached browns, a gray that might once have been blue, catch the thin morning light and hold it briefly. The wind pulls at their layers, setting loose edges fluttering. For just a moment, before the day's work begins in earnest, they stand there wrapped in their stolen, patched, moss-stuffed, seal-fat-scented armor against the world. And they look, against all reasonable expectation, almost dignified. The moment doesn't last. It never does out here. Someone moves first, heading toward the narrow passage that leads to the galley, and the spell breaks. The others follow or drift back to their work, or simply stand there a little longer, unwilling to let the morning have them yet. You follow your nose. This is not always advisable on a ship like this, but the smell coming from the galley is different from the general ambient misery of the lower deck. It's sharper, purposeful. It carries the faint promise of heat, which at this point ranks somewhere above gold and considerably above dignity on the list of things worth pursuing. The passage narrows as you move toward it. The air thickens. And then you find it. A small, dark space that functions as the ship's kitchen in the same way that a man holding a candle in a blizzard functions as a lighthouse. Technically present, doing its best. Not quite equal to the scale of the problem. The galley hearth is built from stones and reinforced with iron plates, and right now it holds almost no fire at all. A few embers pulse faintly at its center, red, then darker, then red again, like something trying to remember what it was supposed to be doing. There is no open flame. There will be no open flame. Because an open flame on a wooden ship is not a source of warmth. It is a source of a much more immediate and permanent problem. This was the calculation that defined every cold night at sea. On one side of the equation, fire, which is warm, which is the thing every cell in your body is currently requesting with increasing urgency. On the other side, the fact that the entire vessel you are standing on is made of wood, sealed with tar, and surrounded by nothing that could help if it caught. The pirates understood this. They chose cold. They chose it every night, with the weary resignation of people who have done the math and don't like the answer but can't argue with it. The men gathered around the hearth hold their hands close to the embers without touching them. Their fingers are cracked and raw, the knuckles darkened by cold and work. They lean in with the careful reverence of people approaching something fragile, which the heat absolutely is. A few degrees of warmth coaxed from the last of the coals, shared between however many men can fit in the room without anyone having to stand outside. There were workarounds. There were always workarounds, because the alternative was simply dying, and crews tended to resist that outcome for as long as possible. Iron pots filled with heated stones or sand were carried below deck when the galley fire was banked for the night. The stones held heat for hours. Not enough to warm a room, but enough to thaw stiff fingers, enough to keep the worst of the cold from settling into the bones before sleep. You can imagine the process. Someone heating the stones in the last of the fire's warmth, wrapping them in cloth, distributing them through the hold like a particularly unglamorous form of gift-giving. Researchers debate the details. Some records mention shielded braziers that burned carefully in sheltered corners when the sea was calm enough to risk it. Others describe sealed lanterns filled with whale oil whose heat, multiplied by layers of wool and packed bodies, created something that technically qualified as warmth if you weren't being too strict about the definition. What everyone agrees on is that the balance was precarious. One wrong decision and the equation tipped, not toward cold, but toward fire, which was the worst outcome by a significant margin. A copper kettle hangs from a hook near the hearth. Its handle has been wrapped with rope to keep it from burning, or freezing, depending on the hour, and from it dangles a small carved fish on a length of cord. A charm. The kind of object that exists in the space between superstition and genuine belief, which on a ship in winter is not really a space at all. It's just where you live. One of the men reaches out and taps the fish lightly before turning back to the embers. The others don't comment. Some gestures don't require explanation. When warmth is this scarce, even faith in a carved piece of driftwood carries a certain practical weight. The wind finds its way down through the cracks above, and the embers respond, flaring briefly, then settling back. The lamp on its chain sways with the ship's motion, throwing light that moves across the walls in long, slow arcs. The men watch the coals the way men on land watch fireplaces, with the specific quality of attention that means you are not really thinking about anything except the light and the heat, and the fact that both of them are still, for now, present. Someone jokes that the ship must be jealous of the warmth. The laughter is short and genuine, which makes it the best sound you've heard since you came aboard. It fades quickly, the way all warmth does out here. But for a moment, just a moment, the cold was somewhere else. The moment doesn't last. It never does out here. Someone moves first, heading toward the narrow passage that leads to the galley, and the spell breaks. The others follow, or drift back to their work, or simply stand there a little longer, unwilling to let the morning have them yet. You follow your nose. This is not always advisable on a ship like this, but the smell coming from the galley is different from the general ambient misery of the lower deck. It's sharper, purposeful. It carries the faint promise of heat, which at this point ranks somewhere above gold and considerably above dignity on the list of things worth pursuing. The passage narrows as you move toward it. The air thickens, and then you find it. A small, dark space that functions as the ship's kitchen in the same way that a man holding a candle in a blizzard functions as a lighthouse. Technically present, doing its best, not quite equal to the scale of the problem. The galley hearth is built from stones and reinforced with iron plates, and right now it holds almost no fire at all. A few embers pulse faintly at its center, red, then darker, then red again, like something trying to remember what it was supposed to be doing. There is no open flame. There will be no open flame, because an open flame on a wooden ship is not a source of warmth. It is a source of a much more immediate and permanent problem. This was the calculation that defined every cold night at sea. On one side of the equation, fire, which is warm, which is the thing every cell in your body is currently requesting with increasing urgency. On the other side, the fact that the entire vessel you are standing on is made of wood, sealed with tar, and surrounded by nothing that could help if it caught. The pirates understood this. They chose cold. They chose it every night, with the weary resignation of people who have done the math and don't like the answer but can't argue with it. The men gathered around the hearth hold their hands close to the embers without touching them. Their fingers are cracked and raw, the knuckles darkened by cold and work. They lean in with the careful reverence of people approaching something fragile, which the heat absolutely is. A few degrees of warmth coaxed from the last of the coals, shared between however many men can fit in the room without anyone having to stand outside. There were workarounds. There were always workarounds, because the alternative was simply dying, and crews tended to resist that outcome for as long as possible. Iron pots filled with heated stones or sand were carried below deck when the galley fire was banked for the night. The stones held heat for hours, not enough to warm a room, but enough to thaw stiff fingers, enough to keep the worst of the cold from settling into the bones before sleep. You can imagine the process, someone heating the stones in the last of the fire's warmth, wrapping them in cloth, distributing them through the hold like a particularly unglamorous form of gift-giving. Researchers debate the details. Some records mention shielded braziers that burned carefully in sheltered corners when the sea was calm enough to risk it. Others describe sealed lanterns filled with whale oil whose heat, multiplied by layers of wool and packed bodies, created something that technically qualified as warmth if you weren't being too strict about the definition. What everyone agrees on is that the balance was precarious. One wrong decision and the equation tipped. Not toward cold, but toward fire, which was the worst outcome by a significant margin. A copper kettle hangs from a hook near the hearth. Its handle has been wrapped with rope to keep it from burning, or freezing depending on the hour, and from it dangles a small carved fish on a length of cord. A charm, the kind of object that exists in the space between superstition and genuine belief, which on a ship in winter is not really a space at all. It's just where you live. One of the men reaches out and taps the fish lightly before turning back to the embers. The others don't comment. Some gestures don't require explanation. When warmth is this scarce, even faith in a carved piece of driftwood carries a certain practical weight. The wind finds its way down through the cracks above, and the embers respond, flaring briefly, then settling back. The lamp on its chain sways with the ship's motion, throwing light that moves across the walls in long, slow arcs. The men watch the coals the way men on land watch fireplaces, with the specific quality of attention that means you are not really thinking about anything except the light and the heat, and the fact that both of them are still, for now, present. Someone jokes that the ship must be jealous of the warmth. The laughter is short and genuine, which makes it the best sound you've heard since you came aboard. But warmth, real warmth, the kind that doesn't require this much negotiation, has never truly been available on this ship. It has only ever been scheduled. You hear the bell before you feel the cold return. It comes from above, dull and hollow, swallowed almost immediately by the wind. A single tone that doesn't linger, but every man in the galley hears it. Shoulders shift. Eyes move toward the ceiling. Someone sets down his cup without finishing it. The watch is changing. This is the clock that the ship actually runs on, not the sun, which disappears for weeks at a time in these waters, and not any mechanical instrument delicate enough to survive the cold and the salt and the violence of daily life aboard. The bell, rung every few hours, marking the rotation of men between sleep and duty, rest and vigilance, the below and the above. Historical records from early privateers describe the watch system as both the spine of shipboard life and its cruelest feature. Too little rest and a man's judgment dissolved. He started hearing things, missing things, making the kind of small errors that became large problems in bad weather. Too much rest and the ship went unguarded, which was a different kind of problem entirely. The balance required constant management, and pirates, who were not, as a general rule, enthusiastic about being managed, found their own relationship with the schedule. Some kept it strictly. Others bent it until it was more suggestion than structure, sleeping when exhaustion made the decision for them and returning to duty when someone shook them hard enough. What mattered, in the end, was not the number of hours, but the rhythm. The pulse of the ship's life, marked by that bell, dividing the darkness into pieces small enough to survive. You climb back to the middeck as the outgoing watch descends past you, their faces gray with fatigue, eyes carrying the particular vacancy of men who have been awake and alert for hours in freezing conditions and are now required to go somewhere small and lie down. They move without speaking. There is nothing to say that the cold hasn't already said more efficiently. The incoming watch surfaces behind them, blinking, pulling coats tighter, stamping feet against the frost-covered planks. One splashes a handful of seawater on his face and gasps at the shock of it, then laughs. It is a completely unreasonable thing to do voluntarily. It is also, you suspect, the fastest way to become functional that this ship has to offer. A curious detail from a 16th century sailor's diary describes how men on watch kept themselves awake through the darkest hours. Not through willpower, which is a finite resource, but through sound. Low humming. Rhythmic tapping of a spoon against a barrel. The slow stamp of a boot on the deck in time with nothing in particular. It kept the body moving when the mind wanted to stop. It kept time when time was the only thing standing between the ship and disaster. You can hear it now. One of the watchmen near the mast, humming something without a clear melody, his breath clouding and dispersing in the dark air. The sound is quiet enough that the sea nearly covers it. But it's there, steady and patient, a small human noise against the enormous inhuman silence of the ocean at night. The helmsman grips the wheel with both hands, his gloves stiff with frost. Beside him, the lookout scans the horizon without speaking. They have been doing this long enough that silence between them is not absence. It is its own form of communication. A language built from shared cold and shared purpose, and the mutual understanding that there is nothing useful to say that the sea doesn't already know. During watch changes, some crews passed a token, a carved bead, a button worn smooth, a short length of knotted rope. The man beginning his shift would hold it briefly, say something quiet that only he could hear, then tie it to his wrist. To lose it was bad luck. To pass it on at the end of the watch was the closest thing to ceremony that the night allowed. You watch one man do it now, receiving something small and dark from the man he's replacing, turning it once in his palm, then securing it to his wrist without ceremony. The other man disappears below without looking back. The bell has already been swallowed by the wind. The rhythm continues. And somewhere in the dark below, the men who just came off watch are already asleep. Or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. The next evening arrives the way evenings do on this ship, not with any particular announcement, just a gradual darkening of a sky that was already the color of a bruise. The temperature drops another degree. The men feel it without discussing it, pulling collars higher, moving closer together without quite acknowledging that they're doing so. Someone produces a flask. It passes hand to hand along the rail without ceremony. No toasts, no formality, just the quiet transfer of something that everyone needs and nobody wants to admit they need quite this badly. The rum is sweet and sharp and earthy, molasses and smoke and something darker underneath. And when it hits the throat, it burns briefly before settling into the stomach like a small, dishonest fire. Dishonest because it feels like warmth. Because it performs warmth convincingly enough that the body accepts the performance and relaxes slightly, shoulders dropping, breath slowing, the rigid posture of sustained cold softening just enough to be noticeable. This was rum's great talent and its great lie. It was both things simultaneously, comfort and catastrophe, depending on the quantity and the hour. It numbed pain that needed numbing. It quieted the specific frequency of fear that lives just below conscious thought and hums continuously on a ship in winter. It filled bellies that had nothing else to fill them, which was not a nutritional solution but was at least a temporary one. On the other hand, dulled reflexes, frayed tempers. The gradual erosion of the judgment required to not do something irreversible. Naval crews had rations. Measured amounts, distributed at set times, logged and accounted for. Pirates had a cask, and whatever agreement they could reach about it, and the understanding that the agreement would hold until it didn't. A cask that was supposed to last a week sometimes lasted a night. Nobody was entirely surprised when this happened. Nobody was entirely happy about it either. The grog, rum cut with seawater, was one solution. It stretched the supply and, according to those who drank it, was easier on a throat already raw from cold and salt air. It tasted, by all accounts, like a decision made under duress. Which it was. But it was warm going down, and warm going down was the only metric that mattered after enough hours on this deck. You accept the flask when it reaches you. The metal is cold against your fingers. Everything on this ship is cold against your fingers. But the liquid inside is not. Quite. You drink. The burn travels down and becomes something else. Something that sits in the chest like an ember and doesn't go out immediately. And you understand, in a way you couldn't have understood an hour ago, why these men organize their evenings around it. One of the pirates begins to hum. Low and unsteady. A tune that sounds less like music and more like the memory of music. Something heard in a port that no longer feels real from here. Played on an instrument nobody aboard has thought to bring. Others join in gradually, their voices rough and imprecise, the melody wandering but the rhythm holding. It sounds like exhaustion arranged into something almost beautiful. Experts continued to debate the physiology of it, whether alcohol genuinely helped sailors survive cold exposure or merely convinced them they were surviving it, which is a meaningfully different thing. Some argue that in small doses the vasodilation was real and the warming effect was real and the morale benefit was real, and that all of these things contributed to keeping men functional through conditions that would otherwise have broken them. Others point out that the same vasodilation that felt like warmth was actually accelerating heat loss, drawing blood to the surface of the skin and surrendering it to the cold at precisely the moment the body could least afford to. Both arguments are correct. The sea rarely offers simple answers. The humming continues, drifting across the deck in the still air. A few men lean back against barrels, eyes half closed. The rum has made time do what rum does. Stretch sideways, lose its edges, become something that moves around you rather than through you. Minutes become uncertain. The cold is still there, has never stopped being there, but it sits at a slight remove now, patient and quiet, waiting for the flask to empty. It doesn't wait long. A shout breaks from the far end of the deck, sharp and slurred, the specific tone of an argument that has been building for a while and has chosen this moment to become external. Two men, a cup between them, a grievance older than tonight behind them. The others move fast, not to watch, but to stop it. Hands on shoulders, voices low, the practiced efficiency of a crew that has done this before and knows exactly how quickly it escalates. It ends quickly. These things usually do, or they end catastrophically, and tonight it ends quickly. The silence that follows has a different quality than the one before. Tighter, more aware of itself. One man tips the last few drops of rum over the side of the rail, murmuring something toward the dark water below. An old superstition, that spilling rum at sea disturbs the drowned, who have some claim on anything that enters the ocean, and that a voluntary offering is better than an accidental one. Whether he believes it precisely or simply finds the gesture useful is impossible to say. The distinction may not matter. The drops disappear into the black water without a sound. The flask makes one more slow circuit and comes back empty. The cold, which has been waiting with great patience, returns. The rum is gone, and with it the last warm thing the evening had to offer. One by one, the men drift toward sleep. Not gracefully, not peacefully, but with the heavy inevitability of bodies that have simply run out of reasons to stay upright. They fold themselves into hammocks, pull whatever fabric is available over whatever parts of themselves they most want to protect from the cold, and go somewhere else for a while. You watch them settle and find yourself wondering where exactly that somewhere else is. Because sleep on a ship like this is not the simple restorative thing the word implies. It is a negotiation, a tenuous agreement between exhaustion and the environment, renewed every few minutes, subject to cancellation without notice by a sudden sound, a shift in the ship's movement, a cold draft finding a new gap in the hull. The men who manage it, who actually cross the threshold into something resembling real sleep, tend to go somewhere specific. They go to land. Old maritime journals are full of it. Sailors describing dreams of green places, of ground that didn't move, of the particular silence of a room with 4 solid walls and no ocean pressing against them from outside. Pirates dreamed of beaches. Not the working kind they knew, salt-crusted and freezing, but the imagined kind, warm and unhurried. They dreamed of fires with no danger in them, of food that didn't require soaking overnight before it could be chewed, of beds that stayed horizontal regardless of what the weather was doing. They dreamed of gold too, but the gold had a way of going wrong in the dream. Coins that slipped through fingers, chests that turned out to be empty, treasure that dissolved the moment a hand reached for it, which might be the most honest thing the sleeping mind ever produced about the nature of what they were doing out here. There was a superstition, half believed, fully respected, that dreaming of fire during winter was an omen. Not a good one. Flames in a dream meant fever coming, or a storm, or something worse that didn't have a name but announced itself this way in the sleeping hours, before it arrived in waking life. Men who woke sweating from a dream of warmth would sometimes not mention it, would lie in the dark of the hold and listen to the ship and decide, quietly, not to share that particular information with anyone. The colder the sea, the more vivid the dreams. That much everyone agreed on. Researchers who study long voyage psychology have written about what extended time at sea does to the dreaming mind. The way the brain, deprived of variety and novelty, begins to generate it internally with increasing intensity. Crews who spent months on the same ship, eating the same food, hearing the same sounds, reported dreams of extraordinary detail and strangeness. Silent cities, landscapes with no horizon, the faces of people they hadn't thought of in years, suddenly present and perfectly rendered and then gone when the watch bell rang. The sea invaded the dreams even when it wasn't the subject of them. A man might dream of walking through a market on dry land, his feet on solid cobblestones, and the cobblestones would tilt, gently, because the body hadn't forgotten where it actually was. The ocean followed them into sleep the way cold follows you into a room. It didn't announce itself. It was simply there. You look at the man nearest you. Beard tangled, one arm hanging loose from the hammock, his hand hovering just above the floor as though reaching for something he set down and hasn't found yet. His lips move faintly. The word they form, repeated twice before his face goes still, sounds like the name of a place. There was a prisoner's testimony, recorded improbably and preserved, about a pirate who refused to sleep below deck during the coldest months. He said he couldn't bear what the dream showed him. Couldn't stand waking from warm, solid, unhaunted sleep into the reality of the hold, the cold, the smell, the endless motion. He slept on the open deck instead, wrapped in sailcloth, face turned toward the stars. The others called him Ghost Lover, which was not a compliment. He said it helped him remember he was free. The testimony ends there. He disappeared at sea a few weeks later. The record doesn't say how. Some crews, in those last minutes before sleep, told stories. Simple ones, about ports, about food, about warmth, about things worth surviving for. The idea was to plant something in the mind before it went wandering, to give the dreams a direction. It worked, or it worked well enough that the practice survived and spread. Men who fell asleep mid-story sometimes finished it in their sleep, their lips moving in the dark, the narrative continuing somewhere the cold couldn't follow. The ship rocks. The hammocks sway. The lantern burns lower. You realize, lying somewhere comfortable right now listening to this, which makes you considerably luckier than everyone in this hold, and possibly makes the fact that you haven't fallen asleep yet a mild personal failing. The hold breathes around you, slow and deep and collective. Outside, the sea moves in long dark swells, and the dreams, whatever they contain, keep arriving. Morning arrives without fanfare, the way mornings do on this ship. A slow, grudging lightening of the dark rather than anything you'd call sunrise. The cold has not improved overnight. If anything, it has had time to settle more thoroughly into the wood, the rope, the bones of everyone aboard, and has taken full advantage of the opportunity. The smell reaches you first. It comes from the galley, not the promising smell of something being cooked so much as the honest smell of something being heated, which is a different and considerably more modest ambition. You follow it forward, ducking under a beam, and find the cook already at work. He is a man of few expressions, most of them variations on resigned, and he stirs his pot with the steady, unhurried motion of someone who has made peace with the fact that what he is producing will not be good and is focusing his energy on making it hot instead. You look into the pot. You look away from the pot. The morning meal on a ship like this is a study in managed expectations. Hardtack, which is called bread, in the same way that a plank of wood is called a tree, technically connected to its origin but transformed beyond recognition, arrives in pieces that require genuine structural assessment before you commit to biting them. Salted beef, packed in barrels with enough salt to preserve it for months and enough salt to make it inedible without soaking it overnight first, sits in thin strips beside it, glistening faintly under the lamp. The stew in the pot is gray and thin and smells of brine and old smoke and the memory of better ingredients. Old seafaring records describe this diet with a thoroughness that suggests the writers were still angry about it years later. The meat was so heavily salted that first-time sailors sometimes couldn't eat it at all. The hardtack, within a few weeks at sea, became host to weevils, small beetles that moved in during the voyage and established themselves with the confidence of paying tenants. The standard practice was to tap the biscuit sharply against the table before eating it, which encouraged the weevils to leave. Whether they actually left or simply held on was a matter of some debate. Nobody was thriving. And yet, here's the thing the records also show. Crews found ways to make it bearable. Someone discovered that soaking hardtack in rum until it dissolved produced something that, with enough molasses stirred in, resembled porridge in the way that a rough sketch resembles a painting. Similar structure, significantly less detail, but warm and sweet enough to constitute a genuine improvement on what it had been before, which was a biscuit you couldn't eat. Inventive cooks, and inventiveness, on a ship like this, was entirely a function of desperation. Experimented with what they had. Crushed biscuit mixed with seawater and rendered fat became something that was described charitably as dumplings. Powdered mustard was added to anything that had begun to turn, on the theory that if you couldn't taste the rot, it had been effectively addressed. This theory had significant holes in it, but it was the theory available, so it was the theory they used. You find a place at the narrow table and accept the bowl placed in front of you. The broth is thin enough to see through in places. It tastes of salt and smoke and something faintly metallic that you decide not to investigate. But it is warm, genuinely, actually warm. And the warmth travels down and joins the place in your chest where the morning's cold has been accumulating, and the two things meet and negotiate, and for a moment, something loosens. Around you, the men eat in the particular silence of people for whom eating has stopped being a pleasure and become a task. Spoons scrape bowls. Someone chews with the slow determination of a man who has found something that requires it and is not going to be defeated by it. At the far end of the table, a disagreement erupts over the last piece of dried fruit. A shriveled, nearly unrecognizable object that has somehow acquired the status of treasure through sheer scarcity. Voices rise. The cook sets his ladle against the pot with a sound like a small explosion. The argument stops. The eating resumes? One curious detail from a merchant's account of the same period describes sailors carrying small cloth bags filled with dried herbs or citrus peel, orange mostly, or lemon when they could find it, which they would hold to their noses during meals to replace the smell of what they were eating with the memory of something better. You can see the logic of it. When the food itself can't be improved, improving what the food smells like is the next available option. When that fails, you improve the smell of the air around the food. You work with what you have. The cook ladles the last of the stew into his own bowl and sits. He has been humming since you arrived. The same quiet, wandering tune he was humming when you walked in. And he doesn't stop now. The melody winds through the galley, mixing with the sound of spoons and the creak of the hull, and it makes the space feel, very slightly, less like a place where people are enduring something and more like a place where people are simply having breakfast. Which is, under the circumstances, a significant achievement. Before you leave, he pours the last of the hot water from the kettle into a small cup and holds it out. His hand trembles slightly from the cold. For luck, he says, without particular emphasis, as though luck is a thing you can transfer in a cup of hot water, which on this ship it might be. You take it. The warmth moves into your palms and stays there for a moment, longer than it has any right to. You drink it slowly because there is no reason to hurry it, and every reason not to. You carry the warmth from that cup for exactly as long as it lasts, which is not long. The cold is waiting for you on deck with the patient certainty of something that knows it will win eventually and is in no particular hurry. The sky has darkened since morning, not toward night, but toward something more purposeful. Clouds dropping low and heavy, the horizon disappearing behind a wall of gray that moves with slow, deliberate intent. The sea has changed color. Darker now, thicker looking, moving in swells that don't break so much as heave. The temperature has dropped again. You feel it in your face before anything else. The specific quality of cold that stops being a sensation and becomes a presence. Something you're aware of the way you're aware of another person standing close. And then you hear it. The sound arrives before the sight. A low, hollow knock against the hull, then another, then a third in quick succession. Ice. Not the thin, drifting shards of earlier days, but proper ice now. Plates and chunks of it moving with the current, finding the ship and announcing themselves against the wood with a tone that resonates through the planks and into the soles of your boots. The pirates hear it too. Movement on deck quickens. Not panic, but the particular efficiency of people who have been waiting for this and have thought about what to do when it arrived. Men climb into the rigging. This is worth pausing on, because the rigging on a ship like this in weather like this is not a place any reasonable person would voluntarily go. The ropes are stiff with frozen salt, rough enough to cut unprotected hands. The footholds are glazed with ice. The wind at that height is several degrees colder than it is on deck, and it doesn't blow so much as slice. And yet men go up there anyway, because the alternative, leaving the ice to accumulate on the sails and ropes until the weight of it threatens to bring the mast down, is worse than anything the climb itself involves. They go up with axes and knives and the grim practicality of people doing an unpleasant job because it is their job and because the ship requires it. The sound of metal on ice fills the air, sharp, rhythmic, almost musical if you're not the one doing it. One account from a merchant vessel of the same era describes the crew singing while they worked, loudly, partly to coordinate their efforts and partly because making noise was the only way to stop thinking about how cold their hands were. The ice on the sails was beautiful and the ice was dangerous, and these two things were equally true and completely compatible with each other, which is something the sea specialized in. Below, the plates of ice bumping against the hull produced their hollow, ringing tone, a sound one navigator described as the ocean's way of knocking. You can hear it now, running the length of the ship in slow, irregular pulses. The men on deck have learned to read it. A single knock means a small piece drifting past. A sustained grinding means something larger, moving with the current, pressing against the wood with a weight that the wood may or may not be equal to. There was a language in it, if you knew how to listen. Sailors who spent enough time in these waters learned the sound the ice made when it was moving toward you. A high, thin whistling that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, as if the cold itself had found its voice. They called it the Song of the Ice, and they did not consider it music. When you heard it, you changed course. When you couldn't change course, you listened to it and hoped. You can hear something like it now, faint, high, threaded through the lower sounds of wind and water. The helmsman hears it too. His hands adjust on the wheel without visible thought, a correction so small you almost miss it. The ship responds, slowly, reluctantly, its hull groaning as it shifts against the current. The oil-soaked rags come out next, lengths of fabric saturated with whatever oil the ship has available, worked into the ropes by hand to keep them flexible in the freeze. Without it, ropes that needed to move would simply stop moving, which on a sailing ship is a problem with immediate and serious consequences. The men do this work without being told, moving along the lines methodically, their hands black with oil in the pale light. Then the sky closes completely. It happens faster than you expect. The clouds dropping the last distance, the light going flat and strange, the horizon vanishing entirely until there is no horizon, only a wall of white in every direction. Snow. Not the gentle drifting kind, but the determined kind, driven sideways by the wind, finding every exposed surface and claiming it. The sea and sky become the same thing. One of the pirates stops working and stands still for a moment, looking out into the white. "The sea's gone blind," he says quietly. No one answers. No one needs to. They pull their scarves higher, lower their heads, and keep working. Because the ice doesn't stop because the visibility has gone. The knocking against the hull continues, steady and patient. The ocean pressing its cold fingers against the wood and testing, always testing, for the place where the wood will give. And the men on deck move through the white, doing what they can, which has always been the only option available. The snow finds its way below deck eventually. Not as snow. By the time it reaches the lower spaces, it has become something else. A damp chill that settles into the air and doesn't leave. A wetness that appears on the walls and the ropes and the fabric of everything stored down here. Slowly, without announcement, the way water always moves on a ship. Through the seams, along the grain of the wood, into the spaces between things that were never designed to keep it out. The smell has changed. It was bad before. Now it carries something additional, something sour and close that you recognize without wanting to name. You find the source quickly enough. In the far corner of the hold, away from the main cluster of hammocks, two men lie still in a way that is different from sleep. Their breathing is audible from across the room. Wet, deliberate. The kind of breathing that requires effort. The cold, it turns out, was never the most dangerous thing on this ship. It was simply the most obvious one. Disease moved through ships like these with a patience and efficiency that no storm could match. It didn't require dramatic weather. It only required proximity, which this ship had in abundance, and time, which the sea provided without limit. Frostbite came first, on the worst nights. The slow, pale creep across fingers and toes and the tips of ears, the skin going waxy and then numb and then, if ignored long enough, something that required a blade to address. Then fever, which arrived without warning and spread through the cramped quarters the way sound did, touching everyone before anyone could do anything about it. Then scurvy, slow and comprehensive, working through the body over weeks. Bleeding gums, joints that ached in ways that made the cold feel almost secondary. A fatigue so complete it became difficult to distinguish from the ordinary fatigue of being on this ship, which was itself considerable. A single cough, one physician's account noted, could travel faster than a cannonball through a ship's lower quarters. By the time the source was identified, the destination had already been reached. You crouch near one of the sick men. His face is pale beneath a slick of sweat, which is its own kind of irony. Sweating in a place this cold. His lips are cracked, his eyes focused on the ceiling with the particular intensity of someone concentrating on something only they can see. His fingers move faintly, reaching for a rope that isn't there. The habit of the hands continuing after the rest of the body has voted to stop. The vinegar came out on ships like this the way prayer came out. Not because anyone was certain it would help, but because doing something was better than doing nothing, and because the smell of it was at least a change from the smell of everything else. Sailors rubbed it on their hands, their faces, their chests. They believed, or chose to believe, that its sourness killed the invisible things that carried illness from one man to the next. The invisible things were not deterred by vinegar. But the ritual of applying it gave the hands something to do and the mind something to focus on, which had its own value. A rat crosses the floor near your feet, moving with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has correctly assessed the power dynamics in this room. The pirates ignore it. Rats on a ship were not guests. They were residents, with all the tenure and entitlement that implied. They ate what the men couldn't finish, which was sometimes nothing and sometimes more than nothing. They warned of rot in the stores by finding it first. They were company of a kind, which sounds like faint praise and on a long winter voyage is not faint at all. Showing weakness on a ship like this carried consequences that had nothing to do with sympathy. To be visibly ill was to become a question. How long, how much, whether the space and the rations and the effort required to keep you alive were proportionate to whatever you could still contribute. Pirates were not, as a rule, sentimental about this calculation. They were not cruel about it either, or not always. They were practical, in the way that people become practical when resources are finite and the sea is infinite and every decision has weight. The debate among historians, whether pirate crews practiced anything resembling quarantine, whether the sick were isolated or integrated or simply left in place while the living worked around them, remains unresolved. The evidence is scattered. What the evidence agrees on is that care existed, in whatever form the circumstances allowed. A shared blanket. A cup of something warm passed from a well hand to a sick one. The small, specific kindnesses that people extend to each other when the alternative is acknowledging how alone everyone actually is. Someone whispers that the fever has taken 3 men since the cold began in earnest. One was committed to the sea wrapped in canvas. The record doesn't dwell on it, and neither does the crew. The others remain. Present, breathing, occupying their hammocks with the stubborn persistence of people who have not yet decided to stop. The living step carefully between them. The ship moves on, indifferent in the way that large things are indifferent. Not cruel, just vast, operating on a scale where individual losses don't register as losses so much as adjustments. Above deck, the snow continues. Below, the breathing continues. And in the space between, in the damp and the dark and the smell of things going wrong, the life of the ship continues too. Diminished, careful, moving around its wounds the way water moves around stone, finding the path that remains open and taking it. You hear it before you see it. A small sound, precise and out of place. A single clean note in the middle of all this salt and suffering. It comes again, and this time you place it. A meow. The cat appears from behind a coil of rope near the mainmast, picking its way across the frost-glazed deck with the unhurried authority of something that has decided the weather is beneath its concern. Its fur is mottled gray, its tail carried high, its expression conveying the specific brand of composure that cats maintain in difficult situations to make everyone around them feel worse about their own reactions. It stops. It looks at you. It looks away, which is worse. One of the pirates crouches immediately, producing a scrap of dried fish from somewhere in his layers with the speed of a man who has been waiting for this exact opportunity. The cat sniffs the offering with appropriate skepticism, then accepts it, and begins to purr. A sound so ordinary, so thoroughly domestic, that it takes a moment to process it against everything else this ship currently contains. The others notice. They always notice the cat. There is a visible shift in the men nearest to it. Shoulders dropping, the hard set of their faces softening by a degree or two, something behind the eyes unclenching. One reaches down and lets the animal climb onto his shoulder, where it arranges itself with its tail wrapped around his neck like a considerably more pleasant version of the scarves everyone is already wearing. The others grin. It is the least complicated moment the ship has produced in days. Cats had been working aboard ships long before pirates made them famous, and they were valued for reasons that had nothing romantic about them. Rats chewed through rope. Rats contaminated food stores. Rats were a practical problem that required a practical solution, and the cat was that solution, operating on its own schedule, requiring no instruction, asking only for whatever scraps the cook could be persuaded to part with. Maritime records from the Middle Ages mention ships' cats as matter-of-factly as they mention anchors. Essential equipment. Expected inventory. But here is the thing about essential equipment that does its job quietly and asks for very little in return. You develop feelings about it. The superstitions accumulated around ships' cats the way barnacles accumulated around hulls. Slowly, comprehensively, and with remarkable staying power. A cat that sneezed meant a storm was building. A cat that washed behind its ears meant the wind was coming. A cat seen running across the deck meant bad weather approaching from whichever direction it had come from. And harming a ship's cat, deliberately, carelessly, in anger or in jest, was understood to invite the kind of ruin that didn't limit itself to one department. It spread. It generalized. The sea would know, and the sea would respond accordingly, and no one on that ship would be unaffected. You would think grown men who had survived things that would end most people's interest in superstition permanently, would find this difficult to maintain with a straight face. You would be wrong. The cat drops from the pirate's shoulder and begins its circuit of the deck, weaving between boots and barrels with the proprietary air of an inspector doing rounds. The men watch it from the corners of their eyes, tracking its movements with an attention they don't give much else that isn't actively threatening them. When it pauses near the rail and stares out to sea, two men exchange a glance. It moves on. They breathe again. Around the cat, tucked into the corners and edges of the ship that aren't occupied by anything practical, you begin to notice the other small things. The piece of cloth wedged between two planks near the hatch, stitched with a pattern that might be a flower, the thread faded but the shape still clear, done by someone with more patience than the ship's general atmosphere would suggest. A seashell tied to a nail above a hammock, turning slowly in the draft. A wooden carving of a woman's face hanging from a beam, rough-edged and not quite accurate, but recognizable as an attempt at a specific person rather than a general idea of one. These things were not practical. They took up space. They weighed something, however little. And yet they were here, carried aboard deliberately, maintained through voyages that stripped everything else down to necessity. One pirate near the mast wears a piece of colored glass on a cord around his neck. Deep blue, smooth-edged, the kind of thing that ends up in the possession of sailors through routes nobody examines too closely. It catches the thin light and throws a small blue shadow across his hand. He notices you looking. Keeps the cold away, he says, with a half-smile that doesn't entirely commit to being a joke. You look at the glass. You look at the frost on the ropes behind him. The cold has clearly not received the message. But the point, you understand, is not efficacy. The point is the wearing of it. The decision, made every morning when he puts it on, that there are things worth carrying. That not everything aboard has to be useful in the way the anchor is useful or the rope is useful. That a man can bring something small and blue and pointless onto a ship in winter, and it can still be doing something. Just something that doesn't show up in the cargo manifest. The youngest pirate sits cross-legged on the deck near the cat, which has settled nearby in a patch of light so faint it barely qualifies. He whispers something to it. You can't hear the words, but the tone is clear, gentle, almost shy, the voice of someone speaking to something that won't judge them for it. He slips it a piece of dried meat from his pocket. The cat accepts without comment. For a moment, the boy's face is just a face. Not a pirate's face, not a survivor's face. Just a young face, talking quietly to a cat on a cold ship in the middle of an ocean that doesn't know his name. Modern historians who study long voyages write about this. The role of small things in sustaining the larger will to continue. The cat. The carved shell. The colored glass. They were not luxuries. They were, in their own way, as load-bearing as any beam in the hull. They held something up that the cold was always trying to bring down. the part of a person that exists before survival instinct and after fear. The part that notices a cat in the sunlight and stops, briefly, to appreciate it. The cat stretches, yawns with extraordinary commitment, and curls into a smaller shape. Its purring fills the space around it, soft and continuous and completely at odds with everything else this ship currently is. The men work on around it, quieter than before. The cat watches you go. You leave the deck and move toward the stern, where a narrow door sits slightly ajar, a thin line of lamplight escaping from the gap beneath it. The captain's quarters. You push it open carefully, half expecting something. Warmth, perhaps, or the particular atmosphere of authority and privilege that the word captain tends to imply. What you get instead is a smaller version of the cold you just left with better furniture. The cabin is not large. It is barely larger than the space two men would need to have an argument in, and the ceiling is low enough that you feel it without touching it. A single lantern hangs from a beam, swinging in a slow arc with the ship's motion, throwing light that moves across the walls in a rhythm that has long since stopped being interesting to the man sitting beneath it. The smell is lamp oil and damp wood, and the faint, sweet edge of rum from a bottle that sits beside the desk. Not quite empty, not quite enough. The captain is writing. He sits hunched over the desk with his coat still on. Everyone on this ship keeps their coat on, always, the calculation of removing it being one nobody is willing to make. His shoulders curved forward over an open book. His hands are rough and scarred in the way that hands become rough and scarred when they have spent decades doing things that hands were not originally designed for. They move carefully, the quill scratching in long, deliberate strokes, producing words you cannot read from where you stand. Captains wrote at night. The journals and logs and letters that survive from this era describe it as a habit bordering on compulsion. Not always the practical records of navigation and cargo and weather, though those were kept too, but the other kind of writing. The kind that happens when a man is the only person on the ship who cannot speak honestly to anyone on the ship. Some kept meticulous ledgers of everything taken and everything lost. Some recorded dreams, which says something about what the dreams contained. Some wrote letters to people they had left behind, in ports they might not see again, letters that were never sent because sending them would require arriving somewhere, which was not guaranteed. The quill stops. He looks up, not at you, but at the small window set into the stern, its glass clouded with frost on the outside and condensation on the inside. The view through it reduced to a gray blur that might be sky and might be sea, and is almost certainly both. His reflection looks back at him from the glass, indistinct, slightly wrong in the way reflections are when the light is bad. He looks at it for a moment longer than seems comfortable, then wipes the condensation away with his sleeve in a motion so practiced it has stopped being conscious. On the desk beside the book, a pistol, polished to a shine that stands out against everything else on this ship, which has stopped being shiny some time ago. A folded handkerchief, its embroidered initials faded to suggestions of letters rather than letters themselves. And a small box, plain wood, unremarkable. He opens it now as though he's forgotten you're here, or perhaps he hasn't forgotten and has decided it doesn't matter. Inside the box, among coins and small pieces of metal whose origins you don't ask about, there is a locket. He opens it with his thumb, the gesture practiced and automatic, and for a moment the light catches the miniature portrait inside. A woman's face. Her expression calm in the particular way that portraits make expressions calm, holding still for someone who needed them to hold still. He looks at it for longer than he looked at his own reflection. Then he closes it, sets it back in the box, and closes the box. He doesn't look like a man who has just done something sentimental. He looks like a man who has just taken his medicine. There are carvings in the wall above the bed, marks cut into the wood at different times, in different depths, some weathered smooth and others still sharp-edged. Ports visited, perhaps. Storms survived. Something worth recording in the only permanent medium available. One mark stands apart from the others. A rough cross, cut deeper than the rest, its edges cleaner, newer. He glances at it when he stands, then looks deliberately away. You don't ask. The bed is against the far wall. A wooden frame, a mattress that was stuffed with straw at some point in its life, and has been slowly redistributing that straw ever since. A pillow damp from the condensation that forms on every surface in this cabin every night without fail. A blanket, thick but heavily patched, covers it. This is the captain's bed. This is the luxury that command provides. It is marginally better than a hammock. Not as much better as you might hope. A captured sailor's testimony from a similar voyage describes a captain's sleep as a coin the sea flips every night. Calm water, he rests. Rough water, he lies awake and listens, cataloging every sound the ship makes and cross-referencing it against everything that has ever gone wrong. The pistol stays within reach, not for enemies outside the ship, but for the ones inside it, which is a thought that fits the man in front of you with uncomfortable precision. He moves to the window again and stands there, his back to you, looking out at the gray blur of the world beyond the glass. His breath fogs the pain. He wipes it away. His breath fogs it again. He stops wiping. Historians who study command at sea in this era still disagree about what held crews like these together. Whether it was fear of the captain or something more complicated, some arrangement of mutual dependence that looked like authority from the outside and felt like something else from the inside. Looking at this man now, you suspect the answer is neither simple nor consistent, that it changed from night to night and storm to storm, and that the captain himself probably couldn't have told you with confidence which one it was on any given day. He stretches out on the bed finally, pulling the blanket over himself, his boots still on, because taking your boots off on a ship in winter is a commitment to remaining horizontal that nobody makes lightly. The pistol goes on the floor beside him, within reach of a hand that will stay closer to it in sleep than it does in waking. The lantern settles into its slowest arc. His breathing slows. Outside, the wind presses against the glass, finding the gaps in the frame and sliding through them with quiet persistence, the way the cold finds every gap in everything on this ship and makes itself at home. The captain's eyes close. The locket is in the box. The box is on the desk. The desk is covered in words that will never be sent. And the ship carries all of it forward through the dark, its captain asleep at last, the sea doing what the sea always does. Waiting, patient, and enormous, for morning to make itself necessary again. The captain sleeps. The rest of the ship does not. You move back through the narrow corridor toward the crew's quarters, and you feel the change in atmosphere before you hear it. A tightness in the air, a quality of wakefulness that has nothing restful about it. The lanterns burn at their usual dim level. The hammocks sway at their usual pace, but the stillness that should accompany sleeping men is absent, replaced by something held and careful, the specific silence of people who are not asleep and are not speaking and are very much aware of both facts. Eyes catch the light. The first voice comes from the far corner. Low, unhurried, the tone of someone who has been thinking about this for a long time and has finally decided that the hour is late enough that thinking about it has become insufficient. He keeps the best of it for himself, the voice says. The bread that still bends. The meat that doesn't need a full night in water before you can chew it. While we eat what the barrel scraped up last. Nobody answers immediately. Nobody needs to. The silence that follows is not disagreement. Another voice from a different hammock, the ones we put over the side last week. He decided that too. Too quick, some say. You stand still and listen and understand that you are hearing something that has been building since before you arrived on this ship. Something that accumulated in the dark the way ice accumulates on the rigging, slowly and then all at once, until the weight of it becomes a problem that can no longer be ignored. Historical records from the age of sail describe mutiny not as a sudden event, but as a slow one. A process of erosion. Loyalty wore away under cold and hunger and accumulated grievance the way wood wore away under water. Gradually, then completely, and usually starting at the point where the strain was greatest. Pirates, who had chosen a life explicitly organized around the rejection of authority, were not more resistant to this than naval crews. They were often less. Captains slept with weapons within reach, not because they feared the enemy at sea, but because they understood the arithmetic of desperation. A crew that was cold enough, hungry enough, frightened enough, would eventually perform its own calculation. And the captain was always a variable in that calculation, never a constant. The standing man in the corner moves, not toward anything, just away from his hammock, his boots heavy on the boards. His face in the lamplight is all sharp angles and shadow, the expression of someone who has spent the night arriving at a conclusion and has arrived. "Keep your mouth shut," he says. Not to you, to the voice in the corner. The words are quiet and carry no particular heat, which makes them more effective than shouting would have been. The voice in the corner goes quiet. A third man from somewhere in the middle of the room, he'll snap soon. Said with the flat certainty of a weather prediction. Not a wish, not a threat, just an assessment of conditions. The short laughter that follows is the kind that recognizes truth rather than finding something funny. You look around the room, at the faces turned toward ceilings, or walls, or the specific middle distance that people stare at when they are pretending to be somewhere else. At the hands that rest too carefully near the edges of hammocks, too close to the handles of things. At the knife that one man holds loosely, not threateningly. He is not pointing it at anyone, not gesturing with it. Simply holding it, the way a person holds something familiar when the world becomes unfamiliar. One of the trial records from a 15th century maritime court describes a mutiny that began over a blanket. A single blanket, taken in the night from one man by another because the cold had reached the point where the calculation of taking it seemed better than the calculation of not taking it. By morning, the deck was stained, and two men stood before a court that was trying to determine at what precise degree of cold a person stops being responsible for what they do to stay warm. The court called it madness born of cold. Reading that account, you could argue with the framing. Standing here, you cannot. Despair, it turns out, is a more reliable fuel for mutiny than greed. Greed requires planning, requires a vision of what comes after, requires enough optimism to believe that after exists and will be better. Despair requires none of those things. Despair only requires that the present has become unbearable, and that someone nearby appears to be the reason. The ship rolls. The lantern swings. The shadows move across the walls in their slow, repetitive arc. And then a voice, not the angry one, not the quiet, assessing one, speaks from somewhere near the door. Calm. Not authoritative exactly, but present in a way that fills the room without effort. Sleep while you can, it says. Morning will judge what we say tonight. The room considers this. It is not, strictly speaking, a resolution. It doesn't address the rations or the decisions or the men put over the side too quickly. It doesn't pretend that the grievances aren't real because they are real, and everyone in this room knows it and the voice knows it too. But it offers something the room needs more urgently than resolution right now. It offers an ending to tonight. One by one, the held breath in the hammocks releases. Shoulders settle. Eyes close or close enough. The knife goes back to wherever knives go when men decide, provisionally, to leave the night alone. The ship groans once, long and low, as though it has been holding its own breath. Outside, the wind rises slightly, moving through the rigging with a sound like a long exhale. And in the dark, the tension doesn't dissolve. It never quite dissolves, not on a ship like this in weather like this. But it retreats to a distance that sleep can bridge, barely, if no one does anything to shorten it before morning. The lantern burns on. The hammocks sway. The knife stays still. Morning comes in quietly, as though it has heard what the night contained and is proceeding with appropriate caution. The light is thin and flat, the color of water left standing too long, arriving through the gaps in the planks without conviction. The cold has not softened. If anything, it has consolidated overnight, settling into the wood and the rope and the spaces between things with the thoroughness of something that has had hours to work and has used them well. But the ship is moving. Slowly, carefully, its hull finding the path between the ice sheets with the patience of a very old animal that has learned not to hurry. And the men are moving with it. Not quickly. Not with any enthusiasm that the word enthusiasm would recognize. But moving, which, after a night like the last one, is the thing that matters. You watch them from the hatch as they surface onto the deck one by one, and you notice something that takes a moment to name. They are not spreading out. They are staying close. The natural tendency on an open deck to find space, to have room, has been overridden by something more immediate. They move to their tasks in pairs. They stand shoulder to shoulder at the rail. When one man stops to work a frozen knot loose, another stops beside him, not to help exactly, but to be there, two bodies generating slightly more warmth than one in the space between them. Nobody discusses this. It requires no discussion. It is simply what cold teaches eventually to everyone it gets hold of long enough. Historical records from a 14th century northern trade voyage describe crews on the coldest nights sleeping in clusters, not in hammocks, but pressed together on the lower deck under shared blankets, bodies arranged for maximum contact, the combined heat of 6 or 8 men doing what no single blanket could do alone. The sailors called it practical, which it was. It was also the thing that kept several of them alive through a winter that killed the crew of the ship anchored half a mile away, who had not made the same calculation. There was a practice among some crews, noted in a 15th century sailor's diary with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recording a navigational technique, called back sleeping. 2 men would lie facing opposite directions, backs pressed together, sharing heat through the night. Not sentiment. Strategy. The body's warmth, surrendered into the air in any other configuration, was retained between them, passed back and forth like the ember in its bowl of sand, kept alive by the simple fact of proximity. You think of the ember now, the heart of the ship glowing in its covered bowl, and understand that it was always a version of this. The same principle. Keep the warmth moving between things. Don't let it settle anywhere long enough to die. Near the bow, 3 men have gathered around a small iron box. One opens it carefully, revealing coals that still hold their red, banked overnight, carried up from below, a fragile inheritance from the previous watch. The heat that rises from it is minimal. Genuinely, measurably minimal. But the 3 men hold their hands above it with an attention that suggests it might be the most important object on the ship, which this morning it possibly is. One of them begins to hum.